Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. It wasn't the first time I'd set out alone into the mountains, but I knew from the moment I stepped onto that trail, something was off. I could feel it in the air, heavy, still, and suffocating. The forest didn't hum the way it usually did. Instead, it watched. I've always been the kind of guy who craves solitude, the quiet of the wild. Some people find peace in a noisy bar or the comfort of a crowded coffee shop. Not me. I find it here, in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but trees, rocks, and the whisper of the wind through the leaves. That's why I came to the Appalachians this weekend, a solo trip to reset. But that day felt different, even from the start. The woods felt darker somehow, colder, though it was late summer. I shrugged it off as a trick of the mind, maybe even excitement. I hadn't hiked this trail before. It was one of those unmarked paths you hear about from other hikers, the ones that barely exist on maps, hidden deep within the folds of the mountains. Perfect, I thought. The sun was still high when I started, but the trees grew dense quickly, their canopy stretching thick above me, cutting off most of the light. As I climbed higher, the trail became rougher, like it hadn't seen feet in months, maybe even years. I didn't mind that. The more untamed, the better. I was about 4 miles in when I first noticed it, this eerie quiet. No birds, no bugs, not even the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. It was like I had crossed some invisible line, and the forest had collectively decided to hold its breath. I stopped for a moment, scanning the woods. Nothing moved. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. It's just the quiet of the wilderness, I told myself. No big deal, but that feeling, that strange prickling at the back of my neck, wouldn't shake loose. It was like being watched, that subtle weight of unseen eyes. I shook it off, picked up the pace, and kept walking. I had a destination in mind, a small, hidden clearing near the peak where I planned to set up camp for the night. By then, I figured the feeling would be gone, but it wasn't. The further I went, the worse it got. I couldn't explain it. Every step felt wrong, off-kilter, like the ground didn't want me there. The trail was narrower now, barely more than a deer path winding between towering trees and slick rocks. A few times I stumbled, tripping over roots that seemed to spring out of nowhere. Then came the sounds. At first they were distant, muffled, a low rustling behind me. I paused, turning slowly. Again, nothing. But the sound persisted, like something or someone was moving just out of sight. It followed me, lingering at the edges of my awareness, just far enough that I couldn't see it, but close enough to make my skin crawl. Get a grip, I muttered under my breath. It's just an animal, a deer, maybe a raccoon. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The rustling was too deliberate, too calculated. An hour passed, maybe more. By then, the shadows were long, and the light filtering through the trees was a deep amber hue. I was close to my destination. I could feel it, but the sounds, they were getting louder, more frequent. Every time I stopped to listen, they stopped too. It was like playing some twisted game of hide and seek. I was starting to get rattled, and I don't scare easily. Years of hiking alone had taught me to respect the wilderness, but never to fear it. But this felt different, primal. Then I saw the tracks. At first, I didn't even recognize them. They were faint, barely visible in the dirt, but unmistakable once I knelt down to examine them. Huge, deep impressions, not like any animal I'd ever seen. They were too large to be a bear, too defined to be from any natural creature. Each print was spaced far apart, as if whatever made them was walking upright. I stood slowly, my heart thudding in my chest. The air was heavier now, almost choking. I wanted to turn back, but something, curiosity, stubbornness, kept me moving forward. I wasn't more than a quarter mile from the clearing when I heard it, a low, guttural growl. It was close, too close. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up as the sound reverberated through the trees. I scanned the forest, straining my eyes against the encroaching darkness. The growl came again, deeper this time, almost like a warning. Then from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. It was fast, too fast for me to catch more than a glimpse, something large, moving between the trees, keeping low, almost slinking. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't an animal. Whatever it was, it moved like it owned the forest, like it belonged here in a way I never could. I started walking faster. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. A bear. No, it wasn't bulky enough. A mountain lion. Maybe, but mountain lions didn't make prints like that. And they definitely didn't growl like that. The growl came again, this time right behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, my breath coming in short. Panicked bursts. For a moment, there was nothing but trees and shadow. Then, in the fading light, I saw it. A massive figure standing just beyond the tree line. Its body was hunched, covered in thick, dark fur that blended almost seamlessly with the forest. It stood on two legs, its arms hanging low at its sides, like a man, but not quite. Its eyes caught the dying light, reflecting it back at me with a sickening, amber glow. It was watching me. I couldn't move. My legs refused to listen to my brain's frantic commands to run. All I could do was stand there, locked in its gaze, my body frozen with fear. Then it took a step forward. Something in that moment snapped me out of my paralysis. My survival instincts kicked in, and I turned, running as fast as I could down the trail. Branches whipped at my face, roots caught at my feet, but I didn't care. I had to get away. The trail was a blur beneath my boots as I sprinted blindly, barely able to see in the growing darkness. Behind me, I heard it moving. It wasn't running, not yet, but I could hear the heavy crunch of leaves and twigs under its weight as it followed, unhurried, like it knew I had nowhere to go. Panic clawed at my chest as I realized the truth. I was miles from anywhere, alone, with nothing but this thing stalking me. I had no weapons, no way to defend myself. All I could do was keep running. I stumbled into the clearing just as the last sliver of daylight disappeared beyond the horizon. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I darted for the far side of the clearing, where the trail led deeper into the mountains, my only chance at escape. But then I heard it. Another growl, this one closer, too close. I skidded to a halt, turning just in time to see the creature step into the clearing. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, maybe more, its hulking form barely visible in the dim light. Its breath came in slow, deliberate puffs, steaming in the cool night air. It stood there, watching me, as if waiting for me to make the next move. My mind raced. I had no plan, no idea what to do. I couldn't outrun it, and I sure as hell couldn't fight it. For a second, I considered climbing a tree, but then I remembered the deep gashes I'd seen in the bark earlier. Whatever this thing was, it could climb. The creature took another step forward, its eyes still locked on mine. There was something almost intelligent in its gaze, like it was sizing me up, deciding what to do with me. In a moment of pure desperation, I reached down and grabbed a rock from the ground, hurling it with all my strength. It sailed through the air, missing the creature by a wide margin, but it was enough. The beast flinched, just for a moment, and in that second, I bolted. I didn't stop running until I was miles away, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. The creature didn't follow. Maybe it was toying with me. Maybe it had gotten bored, or maybe it was just satisfied knowing I'd never return, and I won't. I never looked back, not until I reached my car the next morning, exhausted and shaken to my core. Whatever that thing was, it let me live. But I knew one thing for sure. I was never truly alone in those woods, and I never will be again. Story 2. I never believed in Bigfoot. That is, until that night in the Cascade Mountains, when Jenny and I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway, just the two of us celebrating our 2nd anniversary. Jenny had always been fascinated by cryptozoology, so when she suggested we camp in an area known for Sasquatch sightings, I played along. What could go wrong? As we drove up the winding forest road, the trees grew denser, blocking out most of the late afternoon sun. Jenny's excitement was palpable, her eyes scanning the woods for any sign of movement. "Mike, look!" she exclaimed, pointing to a wooden sign partially hidden by overgrown bushes. "Bigfoot Crossing," it read, with a crude silhouette of the legendary creature. I chuckled, shaking my head at the obvious tourist trap. We found a secluded spot to set up camp, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. As I pitched the tent, Jenny wandered the perimeter, taking photos and looking for tracks. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. "Hey, come check this out," Jenny called. I walked over to where she was crouched, examining something on the ground. "What do you think made these?" I knelt beside her, studying the indentations in the soft soil. They were large, much bigger than any human footprint, with 5 distinct toes. A chill ran down my spine, but I quickly dismissed it. "Probably just some kids playing a prank," I said, trying to sound confident. "You know how popular Bigfoot is around here." Jenny nodded, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. As the sun began to set, we lit a campfire and roasted marshmallows, the flames casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. The forest seemed to come alive with nighttime sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. We were in the middle of a game of cards when we heard it, a long, low howl that echoed through the mountains. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before, not quite human, not quite animal. Jenny's eyes widened, and I felt my heart rate quicken. "What was that?" I whispered, as if whatever made the sound might hear us. "I don't know," Jenny replied, her voice trembling slightly, "but it didn't sound like a wolf or a coyote." We listened intently, but the forest had gone eerily quiet. Even the insects seemed to have fallen silent. I tried to laugh it off, suggesting it was probably just the wind playing tricks on us, but my words sounded hollow, even to my own ears. As we prepared for bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. Jenny seemed on edge too, her usual chattiness replaced by tense silence. Inside the tent, we lay in our sleeping bags, listening to the night. Just as I was starting to drift off, a series of heavy footsteps jolted me awake. They were slow, deliberate, circling our campsite. Jenny gripped my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Mike," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "There's something out there." I wanted to tell her it was nothing, just an animal passing through, but the footsteps were too heavy, too purposeful. Whatever it was big. The steps came closer, and a shadow fell across our tent. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the massive silhouette move past the thin fabric. The smell hit us then, a pungent, musky odor that made my eyes water. For what felt like hours, we lay there, hardly daring to breathe. Eventually, the footsteps receded, and the forest sounds slowly returned. Neither of us slept much that night. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, we cautiously unzipped the tent. The campsite looked undisturbed, but there was a heaviness in the air, like the aftermath of a storm. Jenny gasped, pointing to the ground near our fire pit. There, pressed into the soft earth, was a set of enormous footprints, eerily similar to the ones we'd seen the day before. My skepticism was quickly evaporating. "Maybe we should pack up and head home," I suggested, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. Jenny nodded, her earlier excitement replaced by a mix of awe and apprehension. As we began to break down the camp, a blood-curdling scream pierced the morning air. It sounded like it came from just beyond the tree line, a mix of rage and pain that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We abandoned any pretense of packing neatly, shoving our belongings haphazardly into our backpacks. As I was collapsing the tent, Jenny let out a strangled cry. I spun around to see her staring at our car, her face pale. The vehicle looked like it had been mauled by a giant beast. Deep scratches ran along the sides. The side mirror was torn off, and one of the tires was shredded. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. No bear could have done this, and certainly no human. "We need to get out of here," I said, grabbing Jenny's hand. "Now!" We set off down the road, our pace quick but measured, trying not to make too much noise. The forest felt oppressive, closing in around us. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. We'd been walking for about an hour when Jenny suddenly stopped, her grip on my hand tightening. "Mike," she whispered, her voice quavering. "Look." I followed her gaze and felt my blood run cold. There, partially hidden behind a massive pine about 50 yards away, was a figure. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. For a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then it moved. The creature stepped out from behind the tree, its movement surprisingly graceful for its size. It stood upright on 2 legs, unmistakably humanoid, but undeniably inhuman. Its face was a mix of ape and man, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow with intelligence. We stood frozen, locked in a staring contest with a being that shouldn't exist. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my body refused to move. The creature tilted its head, as if studying us with curiosity rather than aggression. Slowly, deliberately, it raised one massive hand and pointed down the road, the direction we had been heading. Then, just as silently as it had appeared, it turned and loped into the forest, quickly disappearing among the trees. Jenny and I looked at each other, both of us struggling to process what we'd just witnessed. Without a word, we continued down the road, our pace considerably quicker than before. It was another 2 hours before we reached a ranger station, our story tumbling out in a confused jumble. The rangers were skeptical, of course. They'd heard plenty of Bigfoot stories over the years, but something in our shell-shocked expressions must have convinced them to at least check it out. They drove us back to our campsite, where the destroyed car and massive footprints provided undeniable evidence that something had happened. In the days and weeks that followed, as news of our encounter spread, we were bombarded with questions from researchers, journalists, and skeptics alike. Some believed us, many didn't. The footprint casts and DNA samples collected from our campsite were inconclusive, leading to heated debates in the scientific community. Jenny and I have replayed that night in our minds countless times, trying to make sense of what we experienced. Was it a Bigfoot, a Sasquatch, or something else entirely? We may never know for sure. But one thing is certain, there are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk in the shadows of our rational understanding. We still go camping, but now we choose more populated sites. And every time we're in the woods, we can't help but scan the tree line, wondering if we're being watched by those same intelligent eyes we encountered in the Cascades. The wilderness holds secrets, and we had a glimpse of one. It's both terrifying and awe-inspiring to know that there are still mysteries out there, waiting to be discovered. Story 3. There are nights on the job where the forest feels alive, humming with energy, the stars casting just enough light to remind you the world's still turning. But then there are nights like tonight, when the air feels wrong, thick and suffocating, and the darkness presses in like it's hiding something. As I stepped out of the station and into the cold Alaskan wilderness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I've been a park ranger for 6 years now. I've heard the stories, the myths. You get a lot of them when you spend your days and nights surrounded by endless miles of untamed wilderness. People love to talk, love to scare themselves, but I've never been one to buy into those tales. The forest is just that, a forest. There are no monsters lurking in the shadows. At least, that's what I've always told myself. It's been a quiet season up here in Denali. Tourists are fewer this time of year, and most of the hikers and campers are well out of the park by sunset. That leaves us rangers with long, quiet nights to patrol the backcountry. I've always liked the isolation, the way the silence feels like an old friend. But tonight, that silence felt different. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, and I wasn't the only one who felt it. 2 nights ago, we'd gotten a report from a group of hikers about strange sounds in the woods. Deep, guttural noises that didn't match any of the local wildlife. They mentioned broken branches, trees stripped of bark in ways that didn't make sense. At first, I chalked it up to their nerves, city folk out of their element, scared of every rustle in the bushes. But when I hiked out to their site the next morning, I couldn't explain what I found. Broken trees, yes, but the marks were strange, unnatural, like something had torn through with incredible force. Still, I convinced myself it was a bear, maybe a moose. The wilderness does weird things sometimes. But now, standing here on my nightly patrol, I wasn't so sure. The cold bit at my skin as I started my rounds, my breath coming out in thick clouds. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the familiar path I'd walked 100 times. The trees loomed overhead, their bare branches twisting against the night sky like skeletal fingers. The snow crunched under my boots, and the wind whistled through the trees in that eerie way it does when you're alone in the woods. I was about 2 miles from the ranger station when I first heard it. A low, rumbling growl. It stopped me in my tracks, my heart thudding in my chest. The sound was faint, distant, but unmistakable. I stood there for a moment, listening, straining to hear it again, but the forest had gone silent, too silent. The wind had stopped, the trees no longer rustling. Even the distant sounds of nocturnal animals, owls, coyotes, were gone. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I gripped my flashlight tighter and scanned the trees, the beam bouncing off the trunks and snow. Nothing, just the dark, impenetrable woods stretching out in every direction. I forced myself to keep walking, though my steps felt heavier now, more deliberate. My hand rested on the radio clipped to my belt, a small comfort in the vast wilderness, but I didn't call it in. Not yet. There was no need to spook anyone over a sound. The growl came again. This time, it was closer. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as I whipped my flashlight in the direction of the noise. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating nothing but more snow and branches. But the sound, it had been too close. My heart was pounding in my ears now, and I felt that familiar prickle at the back of my neck, the one you get when you know you're being watched. I scanned the forest again, moving slower this time. And then I saw it. Between the trees, just beyond the edge of my light, something moved. It was quick, almost too fast to catch. A blur of dark fur and shadow. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat as I tried to focus on the spot where it had disappeared, but there was nothing there. Just darkness. I told myself it was a bear. It had to be. A big one, maybe, but a bear nonetheless. They were common out here, especially this time of year as they foraged before hibernation, but that didn't explain the way it moved, or the growl, which still echoed in my head like a warning. I kept walking, my pace quickening now, though I tried to stay calm, tried to rationalize. I wasn't far from the next outpost, just another mile, maybe less. If I could just get there, I could call it in, get someone else out here with me. But the feeling that I was being watched, that something was following me, grew stronger with every step. Suddenly, there was a crash behind me. A loud, snapping sound, like a tree branch being torn in half. I spun around, my flashlight jerking wildly, and for a brief second I saw it again. This time, it was clearer. A massive, hulking figure, covered in thick, dark fur, moving on 2 legs. It was fast, impossibly fast for something so large. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't a bear. It couldn't be. Bears don't move like that, and they definitely don't walk on 2 legs. The creature disappeared into the trees before I could fully process what I'd seen. But the image was burned into my mind, the sheer size of it, the way it moved with an unnatural grace. And those eyes, yellow, glowing, watching me with an intelligence that sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't waste any more time. I started running, my boots slipping on the snow as I tore down the path, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. My breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air burning my lungs, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Whatever that thing was, it was following me. I could hear it now, the heavy thud of its footsteps crashing through the underbrush, getting closer with every second. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do. I couldn't outrun it, that much was clear, but I couldn't just stop either. The outpost wasn't far. If I could make it there, maybe I'd have a chance. But the sound of the footsteps was too close now, too loud. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and there it was, bounding through the trees, its eyes locked on me. It was bigger than I'd thought, its body moving with terrifying speed, and there was something in the way it watched me, something that sent a wave of cold terror flooding through me. It wasn't just chasing me, it was hunting me. Panic surged through me as I pushed myself harder, my legs burning with the effort. The outpost was just ahead. I could see the faint outline of the small wooden building through the trees. But the creature was right behind me now, close enough that I could hear its breathing, heavy, ragged, almost like a growl. I reached the outpost and threw myself against the door, fumbling with the keys in my shaking hands. The footsteps were deafening now, crashing through the trees like a freight train, bearing down on me. I jammed the key into the lock and threw the door open, diving inside and slamming it shut behind me. For a moment, there was silence. I stood there, gasping for breath, my back pressed against the door as I listened, my heart pounding in my chest. Outside, the forest was still. No footsteps, no growls, just silence. But I knew it was out there, waiting. I scrambled to the radio, my hands still shaking as I fumbled with the dial. "This is Ranger Kelly at Outpost 3, I said, my voice trembling. There's something out here, something big. I need backup." The radio crackled with static, but no response came. I tried again, but the radio remained silent. The outpost was too remote, the signal too weak. I was on my own. I stood there for what felt like hours, my ears straining to catch any sound, any sign that the creature was still out there. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence of the wilderness pressing in on all sides. Finally, I let out a shaky breath and sank into the chair by the desk, my body still trembling with adrenaline. I didn't know what I'd seen out there, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't a bear, and it wasn't something that belonged in these woods. As the night wore on, I kept my eyes on the windows, watching the darkness, waiting for the creature to return. It never did. But that feeling, the weight of its gaze, the knowledge that something was out there, watching, never left me. And I knew, deep down, that it never would. Story 4. I've spent my entire career capturing the beauty of nature through my camera lens. But on that frigid day in the Colorado Rockies, I became the one being hunted. The morning air bit at my exposed skin as I trudged through knee-deep snow, my breath forming small clouds with each exhale. It was early, the pale winter sun barely peeking over the jagged mountain peaks. I adjusted my heavy backpack, filled with camera gear and survival essentials, and pressed on. This remote area was known for its pristine wilderness and elusive wildlife, perfect for the photo essay I was working on. As I crested a small hill, something caught my eye. Tracks in the snow, unlike any I'd seen before. They were large, easily twice the size of my own boot prints, with distinct claw marks at the tips. My heart raced with excitement. This could be the shot of a lifetime. I knelt down, carefully framing the tracks with my camera. Click! The shutter sound seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness of the forest. As I stood up, a twig snapped somewhere behind me. I whirled around, but saw nothing except the endless white landscape dotted with dark pines. Curiosity overrode caution, and I decided to follow the tracks. They led me deeper into the wilderness, away from my planned route. The forest grew denser, the trees closer together, their branches heavy with snow. The tracks remained consistent, large, purposeful strides of something bipedal, but definitely not human. After about an hour of careful tracking, The trail led me to the mouth of a cave, partially hidden by a rocky overhang. The snow around the entrance was trampled, with more of those massive footprints leading inside. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, but the lure of a potential discovery was too strong. I pulled out my flashlight and tentatively stepped into the cave. The temperature dropped immediately, and I shivered, zipping up my jacket. The beam of light revealed a surprisingly spacious interior, the walls glistening with moisture. And then I saw them. Claw marks, deep, parallel grooves etched into the stone walls, far too high for any bear to reach. My hands trembled as I raised my camera, capturing image after image. Whatever made these marks was enormous, and clearly a predator. As I moved deeper into the cave, the floor became littered with bones. Most were from deer or elk, but some looked disturbingly human-like. A low, rumbling growl froze me in my tracks. It came from deeper within the cave, echoing off the walls. My blood ran cold as I realized my grave mistake. I wasn't tracking an animal. It was tracking me. I turned to run, but in my panic, I slipped on the icy cave floor. My camera clattered away, the flashlight spinning, creating a dizzying strobe effect. In that frantic, flashing light, I caught glimpses of movement. Something massive was approaching, its breaths coming in ragged snarls. Scrambling to my feet, I bolted for the cave entrance. I could hear it behind me, gaining ground with each powerful stride. The sunlight ahead seemed impossibly far away. My lungs burned, legs pumping furiously as I burst out of the cave. I didn't stop running. I plunged through the snow, branches whipping at my face as I crashed through the underbrush. The sound of pursuit was constant, always just behind me. Whatever it was, it knew these woods far better than I did. I don't know how long I ran. Time became meaningless, reduced to the rhythm of my pounding heart and gasping breaths. Eventually, I broke through the tree line into a small clearing. My legs gave out, and I collapsed into the snow, certain that this was where I would meet my end. But the attack never came. Slowly, I raised my head, looking back at the forest edge. There, half hidden in the shadows, stood a creature that defied belief. It was vaguely humanoid, but massive, easily 8 feet tall and covered in shaggy, dark fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of ape and man, with eyes that glowed with feral intelligence. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. I was paralyzed with fear, yet couldn't look away. The creature's chest heaved, steam rising from its fur. It let out a low, rumbling sound, not quite a growl, almost inquisitive. Then, with one last penetrating look, it turned and melted back into the forest. I lay there in the snow for a long time, my mind struggling to process what I'd seen. When I finally found the strength to stand, the sun was low on the horizon. I had lost my backpack with all my gear during the chase, including my satellite phone. With no supplies and no way to call for help, I knew I had to find my way back to civilization before nightfall. The journey back was a blur of exhaustion and paranoia. Every snapping twig made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to hide a monstrous form. It was well past midnight when I finally stumbled into the ranger station, babbling about monsters and caves. The search and rescue team found my abandoned gear the next day, scattered along my frantic escape route, but when they went to investigate the cave, they found nothing. No bones, no claw marks, not even the tracks I had so meticulously followed. It was as if the entire encounter had been wiped clean. Most wrote off my experience as a hallucination brought on by hypothermia and exhaustion. A few cryptozoology enthusiasts latched onto my story, claiming it as proof of Bigfoot or some other undiscovered species. As for me, I'm still not sure what to believe. I've returned to those mountains several times since that day, always with a group, always well prepared. I've never seen the creature again, but I can feel its presence. In the rustle of leaves, in the silence that falls over the forest at dusk, I know it's out there, watching, waiting. My camera was never recovered. Sometimes I wonder if that's for the best. Would the world believe the images, or would they be dismissed as elaborate hoaxes? There are times when I doubt my own memories, questioning if what I saw was real or just a product of fear and isolation. But then I'll wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the echo of that otherworldly growl ringing in my ears. In those moments, I know the truth. There are things in this world beyond our understanding, creatures that lurk in the wild places we've yet to fully explore. I still work as a nature photographer, but something has changed. My images now seem to capture more than just the beauty of the wilderness. There's an underlying tension, a sense of the unknown lurking just out of frame. Colleagues have commented on the new depth in my work, unaware of the true cost of that artistic evolution. I've become more cautious in my expeditions, more aware of my surroundings. Every time I step into the wilderness, I feel a mix of fear and exhilaration. Part of me hopes to encounter the creature again, to prove to myself and the world that I'm not crazy. Another part dreads the possibility, knowing that a second encounter might not end with me walking away. The experience has left me with a profound respect for the mysteries of nature. We humans, with all our technology and knowledge, are still just visitors in the wild. There are ancient things out there, creatures that have avoided our detection for centuries. They remind us that we don't know everything, that there are still discoveries to be made and wonders to behold. As I sit here in my studio, sorting through my latest batch of photos, I can't help but scrutinize each one. Is that a shadow among the trees or something more? Is that blur in the background just a trick of the light, or evidence of something extraordinary? I may never have concrete proof of what I encountered that day in the mountains, but I know what I saw, what I felt. It has changed me, made me both more fearful and more alive. Every time I pick up my camera and head into the wilderness, I carry that experience with me. It has sharpened my senses, deepened my connection to the natural world. To those who doubt my story, I say this: the world is vast and full of secrets. Just because we haven't discovered something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So the next time you're in the great outdoors, take a moment to really look around. Listen to the silence between the sounds. You never know what might be watching you from the shadows. As for me, I'll keep exploring, keep capturing images of the world's wild places. But now, I always make sure to look behind the lens, to be aware of what's beyond the frame. Because sometimes the real story isn't what you're photographing, it's what's photographing you. Story 5. It was the kind of night that lures you into a false sense of security. Clear skies, a light breeze, and a million stars twinkling overhead. I had no idea that, just beyond the warm glow of our campfire, something was watching us. Something that didn't belong. We'd been planning this camping trip for weeks. Mike, Sam, and I had grown up hiking and camping in the Rockies, but this was going to be different. No crowded campgrounds, no people for miles, just the three of us, a couple of tents, and the wild. We found a spot deep in the backcountry, far off any marked trails, exactly the kind of remote place we craved. It felt like freedom out there, surrounded by towering pine trees, the scent of earth and pine sap in the air, the only sound, the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. We'd set up camp in a small clearing next to a creek, the perfect spot. It was a little eerie, sure, being so far out, but that was part of the appeal. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting everything in shades of purple and blue. The fire crackled as we sat around it, talking about nothing in particular, just enjoying the quiet, the kind of peace that only comes when you're far from civilization. "Man, this is perfect," Mike said, stretching out in his camping chair. "No noise, no people, just us and the mountains." I nodded, taking a swig from my beer. "Yeah, can't beat it. This is exactly what I needed." Sam grunted in agreement, poking at the fire with a stick. "No phone service either. My boss can't bother me for once." We laughed, the mood light, carefree, the kind of night that made you forget about the world outside these woods. But that feeling didn't last. It started with the sounds. I didn't notice it at first, too caught up in the warmth of the fire and the conversation. But eventually, I realized that something was off. The night was too quiet. The usual hum of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl had stopped. It was subtle, but the absence of sound felt wrong. I shifted in my seat, glancing around the clearing. The fire cast flickering shadows that danced across the trees. But beyond that, everything was pitch black. The trees loomed like silent sentinels watching over us. I tried to shake the feeling off, but it clung to me like a second skin. "You guys hear that?" I asked, trying to sound casual but feeling the tension creep into my voice. Mike frowned, his gaze drifting toward the tree line. "Hear what?" "Nothing," I said. "That's the problem. It's too quiet." For a moment, none of us spoke. We just sat there, listening. The crackling fire was the only sound. Sam shrugged. Probably just a quiet night. Animals bedded down early. "Maybe," I said, though I wasn't convinced. We tried to go back to our conversation, but something had shifted. The light-heartedness from earlier was gone, replaced by an undercurrent of unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something out there, in the woods, was watching us. An hour passed, maybe more. The fire was dying down, and I was starting to feel stupid for being so paranoid. But then we heard it, a rustling sound, coming from just beyond the tree line. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but it was there. We all heard it this time. Mike's head snapped up. "What the hell was that?" Sam leaned forward, squinting into the darkness. "Could be a deer," he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. The rustling grew louder, and something about the sound set my nerves on edge. It wasn't the soft, natural movement of an animal grazing or foraging. It was deliberate, heavy, like something large was moving through the brush with purpose. I stood up, grabbing my flashlight from the side of my chair. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, just branches and underbrush swaying gently in the wind. But that feeling, that sense of being watched, had grown stronger. "I don't like this," Mike muttered, standing up and grabbing his own flashlight. "Feels wrong." Sam stayed seated, his eyes glued to the tree line. "It's probably nothing, guys. A bear, maybe. They get curious sometimes." "That doesn't sound like a bear," I said, shining my light back and forth across the trees. And then, as if to prove me right, something moved. It was quick, just a flicker of motion at the edge of the beam, but enough to make my heart skip a beat. A shadow, low to the ground, darting between the trees. It was too fast for me to get a good look, but it was there. I knew it. Mike swore under his breath. "You saw that, right?" "Yeah," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I saw it." Sam stood up, his face pale. "All right, maybe it's time we called it a night. Get in the tents, zip up, and wait until morning." None of us argued. The mood had shifted from uneasy to outright fear. We doused the fire, plunging the clearing into near-total darkness, the only light coming from our flashlights. As I zipped up my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring at the thin fabric of the tent, listening intently. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves outside, but there was something else beneath it, a low, guttural sound, almost like breathing. I held my breath, straining to hear more clearly. It wasn't my imagination. The sound was there, soft but unmistakable, coming from just outside my tent. My heart pounded in my chest, and my mind raced through possibilities. Bear? No, bears don't move like that, don't sound like that. I reached for my flashlight, my hand shaking as I clicked it on. The light cut through the darkness, casting strange shadows against the tent walls. I debated whether to unzip the tent and check outside, but fear rooted me in place. Then I heard the snap of a twig. Close, too close. "Mike," I whispered, hoping maybe he had stepped out of his tent. No response. "Sam?" I tried again, my voice barely audible. Nothing. I could hear it now, the slow, heavy footsteps circling the tent. Whatever it was right outside. I felt my pulse hammering in my throat as I squeezed my flashlight tighter. The breathing grew louder, more deliberate, and I could hear something brushing against the side of the tent. I didn't move. I didn't dare. My whole body was frozen with fear, every instinct screaming at me to stay quiet, to stay still. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something I wanted to meet face to face. For what felt like an eternity, the creature, whatever it was, circled the tent. I could hear its weight shifting, the low rustle of leaves under its feet, the occasional growl, so low it was almost inaudible. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the sound stopped. I waited, holding my breath, listening. The forest was silent again, but this time it wasn't comforting. It felt like the calm before the storm, like the whole world was waiting for something terrible to happen. Minutes passed. I didn't dare move. Finally, I heard the sound of a tent zipper. "Guys?" It was Mike's voice, shaky but alive. You okay?" I unzipped my tent slowly, stepping out into the cool night air. Mike and Sam were already outside, both of them pale, their eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear it?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Mike nodded. "Yeah, it was out there, right outside my tent." "Same here," Sam added. "It was circling us." We stood there in the darkness, flashlights scanning the trees. But whatever had been out there was gone. The night was still again, but the fear lingered. "I don't know what that was," I said, my voice trembling. "But it wasn't a bear." Mike and Sam didn't argue. We all knew it. Something had been out there, something big, something that didn't belong. We didn't sleep that night. We stayed up, sitting in a tight circle, flashlights trained on the tree line, waiting for whatever it was to come back. But it didn't. When the sun finally rose, we packed up camp in record time and hiked out of those woods without a word. None of us talked about what had happened, but we didn't need to. We all felt the same thing, that whatever had been out there that night, watching us from the shadows, was still out there, and it was waiting for us to come back. But I knew one thing for sure: we never would. Story 6. I've always found solace in nature, but that day in the Appalachian wilderness taught me that sometimes the forest holds secrets darker than any urban nightmare. The first drops of rain hit my face as I crested the ridge, the sky above rapidly darkening with ominous storm clouds. I cursed under my breath, quickening my pace along the narrow trail. This was supposed to be a simple day hike, a chance to clear my head and test out some new gear. Now, as thunder rumbled in the distance, I realized I had severely underestimated both the weather and my own limitations. The trail ahead disappeared into a thick fog that was rolling in, obscuring the dense forest around me. I pulled out my phone, hoping to check my location or call for help, but there was no signal. Of course, I was miles from the nearest town, and the storm was only getting worse. That's when I saw it, a flicker of something through the trees. I squinted, trying to make out what it was through the deepening gloom and sheets of rain. As I moved closer, the shape solidified into a small cabin, its weathered wooden walls barely visible in the mist. Relief flooded through me, shelter. I could wait out the storm and reassess my situation once it passed. I jogged towards the cabin, my boots squelching in the mud, rain plastering my hair to my forehead. As I approached, details came into focus. The cabin was old, its logs grayed with age, but it seemed sturdy enough. A small porch fronted the structure, and a stack of firewood was piled neatly to one side. It looked like it might be a ranger station or a hunter's retreat, though I couldn't recall seeing any mention of cabins on the trail maps. I climbed the creaky steps and knocked on the door, more out of habit than expectation. When no answer came, I tried the handle. It turned easily, and the door swung open with a low groan. "Ooh, hello," I called out, poking my head inside. "Anyone here? Sorry to intrude, but I got caught in the storm." Silence greeted me, broken only by the patter of rain on the roof. I stepped inside, blinking as my eyes adjusted to the dimness. The interior was Spartan but cozy, a small wood stove in one corner, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a narrow cot against the far wall. A kerosene lamp sat on the table, and I fumbled in my pack for matches to light it. The warm glow of the lamp filled the cabin, and I felt some of the tension leave my body. I was safe, at least for now. I shrugged off my wet jacket and hung it on a peg by the door, then set about getting a fire started in the stove. Soon, the crack and pop of burning wood joined the sound of rain, and tendrils of warmth began to seep into the room. It was only then, as I finally relaxed, that I started to notice the odd details. The layer of dust on every surface was thinner than I'd expect for an abandoned cabin. There were scratches on the inside of the door, as if something had been trying to claw its way out, and the symbols, crude, angular shapes carved into the wooden walls and etched onto the table's surface. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with my damp clothes. I approached one of the walls, running my fingers over the strange markings. They didn't look like any language I recognized, more like pictographs or runes. Some depicted what looked like stick figures, others seemed to be abstract shapes, or maybe constellations. On the table, I found a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. I hesitated before opening it, feeling like an intruder, but curiosity won out. The first few pages were filled with neat handwriting, detailing weather patterns and wildlife sightings, a normal enough forest journal. But as I flipped through, the entries became more erratic, the handwriting degrading into an almost feverish scrawl. It's out there, watching, waiting. The others don't believe me, but I've seen it. Those eyes in the dark, that howl that's not quite animal, not quite human. It's getting closer. The symbols are the only thing that keep it at bay. But for how long? I snapped the journal shut, my heart pounding. This had to be some kind of joke, right? A prank to scare hikers who stumbled upon the cabin. But the fear in those words felt real, visceral. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, making me jump. The storm outside had intensified, rain lashing against the cabin in sheets. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the forest beyond the grimy window. For a split second, I thought I saw something move among the trees, a tall, dark shape that didn't quite fit with the surrounding foliage. I shook my head, trying to clear it. The isolation and the storm were playing tricks on my mind. I was letting an old journal and some weird carvings get to me. I needed to focus on practicalities, staying warm, conserving my supplies, and planning how to get back to the trailhead once the weather cleared. As night fell, the cabin grew oppressively quiet. The storm had passed, but an unnatural stillness had settled over the forest. No chirping insects, no rustling leaves, not even the hoot of an owl. Just silence, heavy and expectant. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the cabin's timbers jolted me awake. In the dim glow of the banked fire, the shadows seemed to move, the carved symbols on the walls almost pulsing with an inner light. It was near midnight when I heard it, a long, low howl that cut through the silence like a knife. It wasn't a wolf or a coyote. It was something else entirely, something that made every hair on my body stand on end. I sat up, straining my ears. There it was again, closer this time. A sound that started as a deep growl and rose to a keening wail that was almost, but not quite, human. My mind flashed to the journal entries, the desperate warnings scribbled on those yellowed pages. Suddenly, the cabin felt less like a shelter and more like a trap. I got up, moving to the window. The moon had risen, casting a pale light over the clearing. The forest beyond was a wall of darkness, but as I watched, I saw movement. Something large was moving between the trees, just at the edge of visibility. A branch snapped loudly, much too close to the cabin. I stumbled back from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. This couldn't be happening. There had to be a rational explanation, a bear, maybe, or a moose, but deep down, I knew it was neither. The floorboards creaked outside, and a shadow fell across the window. Something was on the porch. I could hear its breathing, heavy and ragged, as it moved towards the door. The handle began to turn, slowly, inexorably. In a panic, I grabbed the kerosene lamp and hurled it at the door. Glass shattered, and flames erupted as the oil spread. The thing outside let out a shriek of rage or pain, inhuman and terrifying. I seized my chance, snatching up my pack and bolting for the rear window. I crashed through the glass, feeling it cut into my arms. But adrenaline dulled the pain. I hit the ground running, plunging into the dark forest without a backward glance. Behind me, I could hear the creature's howl of frustration, followed by the sound of splintering wood as it tore into the burning cabin. I ran blindly through the night, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. But I didn't slow down, didn't look back. The sounds of pursuit drove me on, always just behind me, never quite catching up, but never falling behind. I don't know how long I ran. Hours, maybe. The sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn when I finally broke out of the forest onto a road. A car was approaching, and I flagged it down frantically, probably looking like a madman with my torn clothes and wild eyes. The elderly couple in the car were concerned, obviously, but they picked me up and drove me to the nearest town. I babbled about storms and cabins and things in the woods, but I could see in their eyes that they didn't believe me. How could they? In the days that followed, as I recovered in a small local hospital, search and rescue teams scoured the area I'd described. They found no trace of the cabin, no signs of a fire, not even the trail I swore I'd been following. The authorities chalked it up to hallucinations brought on by hypothermia and exhaustion. But I know what I saw, what I heard. Sometimes, in my dreams, I'm back in that cabin, watching the symbols pulse on the walls as something inhuman tries to claw its way inside. I wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of that unearthly howl ringing in my ears. I don't go hiking alone anymore. In fact, I rarely venture into the wilderness at all these days. But sometimes, when I look out at the distant trees, I can't help but wonder, what's really out there, watching and waiting in the dark spaces between the leaves? And how long before it decides to venture out of the forests and into our world? The wilderness holds secrets, ancient and terrible. And sometimes it's better if those secrets remain undiscovered. Story 7. There's a strange quiet that falls over the wilderness at night, a kind of silence that amplifies everything you don't want to hear, the snap of a twig, the rustle of unseen movement, your own breathing too loud in the darkness. That night, as I sat alone in my tent, I felt the weight of that silence pressing in, smothering every instinct except one. Something was out there. I've spent years photographing wildlife in some of the most remote places in the country, always chasing that perfect shot. This week, I was in the dense forests of Oregon, tracking wolves. It wasn't my first solo trip, but something about this one felt different from the start. The forest was thicker here, darker. It had a wildness to it, a kind of untouched, primeval energy that most places lost long ago, and honestly, I liked that. The day had gone by without incident, no wolf sightings, but plenty of signs that they were close. Tracks in the mud, faint howls in the distance, the sort of things that set your pulse racing if you're someone like me. I had set up camp in a small clearing near a stream, far from any trails or signs of human life, just how I liked it, alone, surrounded by the quiet hum of nature. As the sun dipped low, casting the world in shades of orange and gold, I sat by the water, camera in hand, waiting. The wolves would come out soon. I hoped. I was ready for them, more than ready. Camera lenses cleaned, tripod set. But as dusk turned to night and the stars began to blink into existence, the usual chorus of nocturnal life stopped. At first, I didn't notice it. I was too focused on the task at hand, adjusting my gear, setting up for long exposures. But after a while, the absence of sound became impossible to ignore. The constant chatter of the forest, the crickets, the owls, even the wind, had vanished, replaced by a heavy, unnatural silence. I stood still, listening, straining to hear something, anything, nothing. A chill ran down my spine, despite the warm summer air. I told myself it was fine, that I was just overthinking it. Silence happens. Animals move on. But the rational part of my brain was having trouble convincing the instinctual part. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to head back to my tent, calling it a night. I could get up early, catch the wolves at dawn. But even as I moved through the clearing, the silence seemed to cling to me, thick and oppressive. My footsteps felt too loud, too deliberate against the soft earth, and every few steps I found myself glancing back at the trees, half expecting to see something there, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. But there was nothing. The tent offered some comfort. The familiar smell of canvas and the small circle of light from my lantern easing the tension in my chest. I sat inside, flipping through the photos I'd taken earlier, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling, just outside. I froze, every muscle tensing as I listened. It was subtle, almost like the wind, but too steady, too deliberate. Something was moving out there just beyond the thin walls of my tent. My heart started to race, my mind running through possibilities. A bear, maybe, or a deer. But it didn't sound right. It was too calculated. Like whatever it was trying not to be heard. I grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it toward the tent flap, the small beam of light shaking in my hands. For a few moments, I didn't move, just listened. The rustling had stopped. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe. A shadow passed across the tent, large and unmistakable. I sucked in a sharp breath, my pulse thundering in my ears. Whatever was out there, it was big, and it was close. I don't know why I did it, but I stood up, unzipped the tent, and stepped outside, flashlight pointed into the darkness. The beam cut through the night, illuminating the trees, the underbrush, but nothing else. The air was still, the forest frozen in time. I swept the light in every direction, but whatever had been there, it was gone. But I could feel it, something out there just beyond the reach of the light, watching me. I scanned the ground near the tent, searching for tracks, but found nothing unusual. No broken branches, no disturbed earth. It didn't make sense. How could something that big move so silently? I tried to shake off the fear, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. Maybe I was just tired, more on edge than usual after being out here alone for days. But deep down, I knew better. I went back inside the tent, zipped it up tight and tried to settle in, but sleep was out of the question. Every little noise, the wind brushing against the fabric, the distant creak of branches, felt amplified. Like the forest was breathing down my neck. I lay there wide awake, flashlight clutched in my hand, waiting. Hours passed like this, my mind racing, my body tense, every sense on high alert. And then, just when I thought I might drift off, I heard it again. The breathing. It was faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of my own heart, but it was there, slow, deliberate, and too close. I held my breath, trying to make out where it was coming from. The trees, the creek. No, it was closer than that, much closer. I shifted in my sleeping bag, my fingers tightening around the flashlight, ready to shine it on whatever was out there. But I was terrified of what I might see. The breathing grew louder, more pronounced, like something large was standing right outside the tent, and then the tent wall moved. It was subtle, just the faintest ripple in the fabric, like something brushing against it, but it was enough to send a surge of panic through me. I shot up, unzipping the tent in one swift motion and shining the flashlight into the darkness, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating nothing but empty space. But I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel it. The same weight I'd felt earlier, that oppressive silence, the sense of being watched. It was stronger now. I wasn't imagining it. Something was out there, just beyond the light, hiding in the shadows. I took a few shaky steps away from the tent, scanning the tree line, my heart hammering in my chest. And then, Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a figure standing just at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, taller than any person should be, and covered in what looked like fur, dark and matted. It stood on two legs, its body hunched, as if it were trying to remain hidden behind the trees. But its eyes were glowing, reflecting the light from my flashlight in a way that no animals should. I froze, my mouth going dry, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, locked in a staring contest with whatever that thing was. It didn't move, didn't growl or make any sound, but I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive, like it was studying me. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in that silent standoff, but it felt like an eternity. And then, slowly, it turned and disappeared into the trees, its massive form melting into the darkness as if it had never been there at all. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I scrambled back to the tent, grabbed my gear, and packed up as quickly as my shaking hands would allow. Within minutes, I was on the trail, moving as fast as I could through the dense forest, not stopping until I reached my car hours later. Even as I drove away, the image of that thing, those glowing eyes, was burned into my mind. I've spent years in the wilderness, and I thought I knew it, but now I realize how wrong I was. There are places out there that don't belong to us, places where something older and far more dangerous watches from the shadows, and I'll never go back to that forest again. Story 8. I've been a hunter for over 3 decades, tracking everything from deer to bear across the rugged landscapes of North America. But nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for what I encountered in the dense forests of northern Michigan that fateful autumn day. The crisp October air nipped at my face as I made my way through the underbrush, my trusted rifle slung over my shoulder. It was the second day of deer season, and I was following what I thought was the trail of a wounded buck. The blood trail was sparse but consistent, leading me deeper into a part of the forest I'd never explored before. The woods were unusually quiet that morning. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the leaves, just the soft crunch of my boots on the forest floor and the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. It should have been my first warning sign, but I was too focused on the hunt to notice. As I pushed through a particularly dense thicket, the forest suddenly opened up into a small clearing. What I saw there stopped me dead in my tracks. In the center of the clearing lay the carcass of a large deer, but it wasn't the buck I'd been tracking. This animal had been torn apart, its ribcage splayed open and innards scattered across the ground. My first thought was that a bear must have gotten to it, but something didn't add up. The kill was too messy, too violent even for a bear, and there was something else, a detail that sent a chill down my spine. Some of the meat had been stripped clean off the bone, almost surgically. I approached cautiously, my hand instinctively moving to the butt of my rifle. The coppery smell of blood mixed with something else, a musky odor I couldn't quite place. As I knelt to examine the carcass more closely, a twig snapped behind me. I spun around, bringing my rifle up in one fluid motion honed by years of practice. But what I saw through my scope made my blood run cold. A pair of eyes, glowing red in the shadows, stared back at me. They were set too high off the ground to be a bear or a wolf, and they held an intelligence that was unnervingly human. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then a low, rumbling growl broke the silence, a sound so deep I felt it in my chest. The creature stepped forward, and I finally got a clear look at it. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. Its body was powerfully built, with long arms ending in hands tipped with wicked claws. But it was the face that truly terrified me, a nightmarish blend of wolf and man, with a protruding snout full of sharp teeth and those glowing red eyes fixed directly on me. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Werewolf, my brain supplied helpfully, though I immediately rejected the idea. This was real, not some creature from folklore or cheap horror movies. The beast took another step forward, and my survival instincts finally kicked in. I fired, the crack of the rifle shattering the eerie silence of the forest. The bullet hit it square in the chest, and for a split second I felt a surge of relief. But the creature didn't fall. It stumbled back a step, more surprised than hurt, then let out a roar of rage that shook the trees around us. Before I could chamber another round, it charged. I dove to the side, feeling the rush of air as massive claws swiped through the space where I'd just been standing. I scrambled to my feet and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no thought of stealth or direction. Pure terror drove me forward, the sound of pursuit close behind. Branches whipped at my face as I ran, my lungs burning with each gasping breath. I could hear the creature behind me, moving with impossible speed through the dense forest. In desperation, I veered towards a steep ravine I remembered from my map of the area. As I reached the edge, I hesitated for a fraction of a second, long enough for a heavy weight to slam into my back, sending us both tumbling over the edge. The world spun as we rolled down the steep incline, a tangle of limbs and fur and panic. We hit the bottom hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Dazed, I looked up to see the creature rising to its feet, shaking off the fall like it was nothing. I tried to move, but pain shot through my leg. Glancing down, I saw my ankle was twisted at an unnatural angle. The beast approached slowly now, almost casually, as if savoring the moment. I groped frantically in the leaves around me, searching for my rifle, but it was nowhere to be found. This was it, I thought. This is how I die. But as the creature loomed over me, something unexpected happened. It tilted its head, regarding me with what I could only describe as curiosity. Those red eyes, which had seemed so full of rage before, now held a spark of something almost human. For a long moment, we stared at each other. I was acutely aware of my heartbeat thundering in my ears, of the cold ground beneath me, of the creature's hot breath on my face. Then, to my utter astonishment, it spoke. The sound was guttural, more growl than word, but unmistakably language. "Hunt, it rumbled, the effort seeming to cause it pain. "You hunt, we same." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This creature, this impossible being, was trying to communicate. What are you?" I managed to croak out. The beast gestured to itself with a clawed hand. "Old, older than your kind. We were first hunters." My mind raced, trying to process this information. Was it claiming to be some kind of prehistoric species, a missing link in human evolution, or something else entirely? "Why did you attack me?" I asked, my fear slowly being replaced by a sort of numb fascination. The creature's face contorted in what might have been a grimace. "Protect territory. You threaten." I thought back to the deer carcass, realizing now that I had stumbled into its hunting ground, its home. "I'm sorry," I said, surprising myself with the sincerity in my voice. "I didn't know." The beast nodded slowly, then stepped back, giving me space. It pointed off into the distance. "Your kind. That way. Go. Do not return." Wincing, I pulled myself to my feet, keeping weight off my injured ankle. The creature watched impassively as I limped past it, heading in the direction it had indicated. As I reached the edge of the clearing, I turned back. Will I see you again?" I asked, not sure why I even cared. The creature's eyes seemed to soften for a moment. "Perhaps if you learn to see..." With that cryptic response, it turned and loped off into the forest, quickly disappearing among the trees. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the spot where it had vanished, before the pain in my ankle reminded me of my predicament. It took me hours to limp back to my truck, my mind churning the whole way. By the time I reached civilization, I had almost convinced myself that the entire encounter had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Almost. In the years since, I've returned to those woods many times. I've never seen the creature again, but sometimes, When the forest goes quiet and the shadows seem to move in unnatural ways, I feel its presence, watching, waiting. I still hunt, but with a newfound respect for the wilderness and its secrets. I've learned to move more quietly, to observe more carefully, to listen not just with my ears, but with some deeper sense I never knew I had. And sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, when the line between reality and dream blurs, I hear that rumbling voice again. Learn to see. I'm still trying to understand what it meant, but I know one thing for certain. There are wonders and terrors in this world far beyond our understanding, and sometimes, if we're very lucky or very cursed, we catch a glimpse of them. The forest holds ancient secrets, and I've been privileged or damned to glimpse one of them. It's changed me, made me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world and our place in it. And as I sit here, writing this account, I can't help but wonder how many other secrets are out there, hiding just beyond the veil of our perception, and what will happen when they decide to reveal themselves. Story 9. They say the mountains hold secrets, but no one ever tells you how to listen for them. That night, deep within the belly of the Colorado wilderness, I didn't need to listen. I felt it. Whatever was hidden in that cave was not meant to be disturbed, and yet we had walked right into its lair. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip, just me and Sarah, hiking and exploring some of the lesser-known caves in the Rockies. We'd done this sort of thing before, spending days off-grid, no cell service, no people, just us and nature, the perfect escape from the monotony of our daily lives. But this time felt different. The trail to the cave was barely visible, more of an overgrown deer path than a proper hiking trail. The deeper we ventured, the more the trees seemed to close in around us, casting long, creeping shadows that clung to the ground like the forest was trying to swallow us whole. I should have taken that as a sign, but I didn't. We were too focused on finding the cave. We'd heard about it from an old hiker we'd met a few months back, a man who claimed there were untouched caves hidden high up in these mountains, places where no tourist would ever venture. We were intrigued, of course. Sarah's fascination with geology and my love for the unknown made the cave irresistible. We reached the entrance by late afternoon. It was a narrow, jagged opening, almost hidden by a thick layer of moss and brush. If you didn't know it was there, you'd walk right past it. The air around it felt different, cooler, even though the sun was still strong in the sky. The cave exhaled a constant breath of cold air, as if the mountain itself was alive, and something deep inside it was stirring. "I guess this is it," Sarah said, crouching down to peer into the darkness. She sounded excited, but there was an edge to her voice, something that I couldn't quite place. "Yeah," I muttered, adjusting my backpack. "Let's take a quick look inside, then set up camp nearby. We can explore more tomorrow." Sarah nodded, pulling out her flashlight and stepping into the cave without hesitation. I followed, my flashlight cutting through the dense darkness. The walls were damp and rough, the ceiling low enough in some spots that we had to crouch. It didn't take long for the light from the entrance to fade, leaving us alone in the black void. The silence inside the cave was overwhelming. Even the sound of our footsteps seemed to vanish into the thick, cold air, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. Every now and then, a drip of water echoed from somewhere deeper within, but it was impossible to tell where it was coming from. We walked deeper, our flashlights illuminating strange rock formations and jagged stalactites that hung like the teeth of some ancient beast. The air smelled musty, like wet stone and decay. "This place is incredible," Sarah whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "No one's been here in a long time." "Yeah," I agreed, though I was starting to feel uneasy. Something about the air felt wrong, heavier, almost like it was pressing down on us the further we went in. I glanced back toward the entrance, but it was long out of sight now, just a memory of daylight. We didn't go too far, just enough to get a sense of the place. Sarah wanted to take some rock samples, but I was eager to get back outside, to the fresh air and the safety of the open sky. Something about being in that cave made my skin crawl. Let's head back, I said, a little too quickly. We can set up camp and come back tomorrow with fresh batteries. Sarah hesitated but eventually agreed, and we turned to leave. That's when we heard it. A sound, faint, distant, but unmistakable. A low, rumbling noise that seemed to vibrate through the stone walls. It wasn't the drip of water or the groan of shifting rock. No, this was something different, something alive. We both froze, flashlights darting toward the sound, but there was nothing, just the same jagged walls and blackness stretching out before us. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky now. "Yeah," I whispered, my throat suddenly dry. "Let's get out of here." We picked up the pace, moving quickly toward where we thought the entrance was, but the cave twisted and turned in ways that felt unfamiliar. The further we went, the more the walls seemed to close in on us, the ceiling pressing down. The sound came again, louder this time. It echoed through the cave, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from every direction at once. My heart started to race, my hands slick with sweat despite the cold. "What the hell is that?" Sarah muttered, her light shaking as she scanned the walls. "I don't know, but we need to go. Now." We moved faster, our footsteps echoing in the narrow passage, but the growling sound didn't fade. It grew closer, louder. Then something moved in the darkness ahead. I stopped dead in my tracks, yanking Sarah back. "Wait," I whispered. We both stood there, frozen, flashlights trained on the black void in front of us. The beam barely penetrated the darkness, but I could see something just for a second. A shadow, hulking and massive, disappearing around the bend in the cave. My blood turned to ice. We weren't alone. "Did you see that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We need to go now." We turned and ran, no longer caring about being careful. The cave twisted and turned, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we stumbled through the narrow passages. The growling sound grew louder, more insistent, reverberating off the walls like it was chasing us. I didn't dare look back. "Where's the exit?" Sarah gasped, her breathing ragged as we turned yet another corner. "And it's got to be close," I panted, but in truth I had no idea. The cave seemed to be playing tricks on us, leading us deeper when we thought we were heading out. The growling stopped. We came to a halt, gasping for breath, the oppressive silence rushing in around us. I shone my flashlight behind us, but there was nothing, just darkness. For a moment, I thought we'd lost whatever was following us. I thought we might make it out after all. Then I heard the whisper. It was so soft at first I thought I was imagining it, but it was there, faint and chilling, a low, rasping voice that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. "Leave." Sarah's eyes went wide, and I felt the blood drain from my face. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, my mouth too dry to speak. "Leave. Now." The voice was closer now, louder, filling the narrow passage. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. I didn't need to be told twice. We bolted, running faster than I thought possible, our flashlights flickering as we dashed through the twisting, suffocating tunnels. The cave felt like it was closing in on us, squeezing the air from our lungs. My heart pounded in my chest, fear driving me forward. And then, finally, mercifully, I saw it, the faint outline of daylight, barely visible through the narrow entrance. "Go!" I shouted, pushing Sarah ahead of me as we scrambled toward the light. We burst out of the cave, stumbling into the fading daylight, gasping for air. The cold, fresh air was like a balm to my burning lungs, but I didn't stop running until we were far from the cave's entrance, the forest closing in around us. Only then did we stop, collapsing onto the ground, panting and shaking. For a long time, neither of us spoke. We just sat there, staring back at the cave's dark entrance, the growling still echoing in my mind. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. What was that?" "I don't know," I said, my voice hoarse, "but I'm not going back to find out." And I meant it. Whatever was in that cave, whatever had whispered for us to leave, it wasn't something we were meant to understand, and it wasn't something I ever wanted to meet again. We packed up camp in silence, neither of us daring to look back at the cave as we hiked out of the woods. The mountains hold their secrets, and we had gotten too close to one of them, but some secrets are better left buried. Story 10. I've always believed that the great outdoors held more beauty than danger, but on that moonless night in the Adirondacks, I learned that sometimes the line between wonder and terror is thinner than we'd like to admit. Emily and I had been planning this hiking trip for months, a week away from the chaos of the city, just us and the wilderness. We were experienced hikers, but this was our first time tackling a multi-day trek in such a remote area. The trail we'd chosen was challenging, but promised breathtaking views and a true taste of untamed nature. The first 2 days were everything we'd hoped for. Crystal clear streams, towering pines, and glimpses of wildlife that left us awestruck. We felt alive, connected to the earth in a way that's impossible to achieve in the concrete jungle we called home. On the 3rd day, things began to change. The weather, which had been perfect until then, took a turn. Dark clouds rolled in, bringing with them a bone-chilling wind that seemed to cut right through our jackets. We pushed on, hoping to reach the next designated campsite before the storm hit in full force. We didn't make it. The rain started as a light drizzle, but quickly turned into a torrential downpour. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the trail became a treacherous mud slick. After nearly twisting an ankle for the 3rd time, I called out to Emily over the howling wind. "We need to stop and set up camp. It's too dangerous to keep going." She nodded, her face a mask of determination and exhaustion. We veered off the trail, looking for any spot flat enough to pitch our tent. Finally, we found a small clearing partially sheltered by a stand of thick pines. Our hands were numb with cold as we struggled to set up the tent, the wind threatening to tear it from our grasp at any moment. But years of practice paid off, and soon we had our shelter erected and secured. We dove inside, dragging our sodden packs with us. The relief of being out of the rain was immediate, but as we peeled off our wet outer layers, the chill set in. I dug through my pack for dry clothes, my fingers clumsy with cold. "So much for our relaxing getaway," Emily said with a weak laugh, wringing water from her long dark hair. I managed a smile in return. "Hey, at least we're making memories, right?" We changed quickly and huddled in our sleeping bags, sharing body heat and what remained of our trail-mixed dinner. Outside, the storm raged on, rain pelting the tent like tiny bullets. Despite the chaos of the elements, exhaustion soon overtook us, and we drifted into an uneasy sleep. I'm not sure what woke me first, the sudden silence as the storm finally passed, or the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through the wet leaves outside our tent. My eyes snapped open, heart instantly racing. Next to me, I could feel Emily tense, her breath catching in her throat. She'd heard it too. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, much too heavy to be a deer or any of the smaller forest creatures we'd encountered. Whatever was out there was big, and it was circling our tent. I reached for the flashlight we'd left by the tent flap, my hand trembling slightly. Emily gripped my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. The silent question in her wide eyes was clear. "What do we do?" I put a finger to my lips, gesturing for her to stay quiet. Maybe if we didn't make a sound, whatever it was would lose interest and move on. It was a feeble hope, but it was all we had. The footsteps continued their slow circuit around our tent. With each pass, they seemed to pause a little longer, as if the creature was considering its next move. The silence between each step was almost worse than the sound itself, leaving us in suspense, wondering where it would land next. Then came a new sound, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath us. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite bear, not quite wolf, but something primally terrifying that spoke to the most ancient part of our brains. Emily's grip on my arm tightened to the point of pain. I could feel her whole body trembling against mine. I wasn't faring much better. My heart pounding so hard I was sure the creature outside must be able to hear it. The growl came again, closer this time. A shadow fell across the tent, massive and hulking. I could hear its breathing now, heavy and ragged, just on the other side of the thin fabric that suddenly felt absurdly inadequate as protection. Time seemed to stretch, each second lasting an eternity as we waited, barely daring to breathe. Then, ever so slowly, the zipper of our tent began to move. Emily let out a small whimper, quickly muffled as she buried her face in my shoulder. I raised the flashlight, my thumb hovering over the switch. It was a pitiful defense, but it was all we had. The zipper inched higher, agonizingly slow. A gap appeared at the bottom of the tent flap. In the faint moonlight that now filtered through the trees, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold, a massive, clawed hand, covered in dark fur, reaching for the opening. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I flicked on the flashlight, aiming the beam directly at the gap in the tent. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice sounding strangled and foreign to my own ears. "Get out of here!" The effect was instantaneous. The creature let out a roar of surprise or anger, I couldn't tell which, and jerked back from the tent. The beam of the flashlight caught it for just a split second as it reared up, but that glimpse was enough to haunt my nightmares for years to come. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, with a body that seemed to be an impossible mix of bear and man. Its face was long and wolf-like, with eyes that glowed an eerie yellow in the flashlight beam. But it was the intelligence in those eyes that truly terrified me. This was no mere animal. As quickly as it had appeared, the creature vanished into the darkness beyond our little clearing. The sound of its retreat, branches snapping and underbrush being trampled, faded into the distance. Emily and I sat frozen for what felt like hours, straining our ears for any sign of its return. Eventually, the normal sounds of the forest at night slowly resumed, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. What was that thing?" Emily whispered, her voice hoarse with fear. I shook my head, unable to find words to describe what we'd just encountered. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear standing on its hind legs, some undiscovered species, a hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew none of those explanations fit what we'd seen. We didn't sleep for the rest of the night, huddled together in the center of the tent, jumping at every sound. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, we packed up camp in record time, eager to put as much distance between us and this place as possible. The hike back to civilization was a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. Every shadow seemed to hide a lurking threat. Every snapping twig sent our hearts racing. We didn't stop to rest, didn't even pause to eat, driven by a primal need to return to the safety of the known world. It was late afternoon by the time we reached the ranger station at the trailhead. The look on our faces must have told a story, because the ranger on duty immediately ushered us inside, sitting us down with hot coffee and a barrage of questions. We told him everything, our words tumbling out in a confused jumble. To his credit, he listened without interruption, his face growing increasingly grave. When we finished, he sat back with a heavy sigh. "You're not the first to report something like this," he said quietly. "We get a handful of similar stories every year. Most folks write it off as bear encounters or overactive imaginations. But," he trailed off, his gaze drifting to a map of the park on the wall. There were several areas marked off in red, areas I now realized were suspiciously close to where we'd made camp. "Let's just say there are parts of these woods that are older and wilder than most people realize," he continued. "Places where the line between legend and reality gets a little blurry." In the days and weeks that followed, Emily and I tried to make sense of what we'd experienced. We researched cryptozoology, delved into local legends, even considered the possibility of some government experiment gone wrong. But no explanation ever fully satisfied us. We still hike, still find joy in the beauty of nature, but now we do so with a newfound respect for the unknown, for the wild places that still exist in our world, and sometimes, when the wind whispers through the trees just right, I could swear I hear that growl again, a reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. The creature in the night remains a mystery, a shadow at the edge of our reality. But one thing is certain, the wilderness holds secrets, ancient and profound, and sometimes, if we're not careful, those secrets find us. Story 11. I've been guiding fishing trips for over 2 decades. But nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for what lurked beneath the surface of Shadow Lake. What started as a routine expedition turned into a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. It was early June, the perfect time for bass fishing in the remote wilderness of northern Minnesota. I had a group of 5 eager anglers, 3 middle-aged buddies on their annual guys trip, a father-son duo looking to bond, and myself. We'd loaded up my trusty old van and set out at dawn, excitement buzzing in the air as we left civilization behind. Shadow Lake wasn't on any tourist maps. It was a hidden gem I'd discovered years ago, a pristine body of water nestled deep in the forest, far from the usual crowded fishing spots. The lake had always been good to me, yielding impressive catches that kept my clients coming back year after year. As we unloaded our gear at the lakeside, I couldn't shake a strange feeling of unease. The usually tranquil surface of the water seemed different somehow. There was an odd stillness to it, as if the lake itself was holding its breath. "You okay, Mark?" asked Tom, one of the regulars. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a smile, shaking off the sensation. "Just excited to see what we'll catch today," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. We got the boats in the water and spread out across the lake. The morning passed uneventfully, with a decent but not spectacular catch. As the sun climbed higher, casting shimmering reflections across the water, that nagging feeling of wrongness grew stronger. It was just after noon when we heard the first splash. It came from the center of the lake, far larger than any fish should have made. We all turned to look, but the ripples had already faded by the time our eyes found the spot. "Must have been a big one," chuckled Mike, the youngest of the group. "Hope it didn't scare away all its friends." We laughed it off, but I noticed the others casting nervous glances at the water. The easy banter of the morning had been replaced by intense silence, broken only by the occasional slap of a fish on the surface. As afternoon wore on, the splashes became more frequent. Sometimes they were accompanied by a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from the depths of the lake itself. Each time, we'd turn to look, but never quite fast enough to see what was causing the disturbance. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, we were all on edge. The fish had stopped biting entirely, as if they'd gone into hiding. I suggested we call it a day and head back to shore. We were about halfway to the bank when it happened. A massive shape breached the surface no more than 20 feet from my boat. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of something that defied explanation. A long, serpentine neck, a head that seemed too large and oddly shaped to belong to any known aquatic creature. Then it was gone, leaving behind a wake that rocked our boats violently. Panic set in immediately. Shouts of fear and disbelief filled the air as we all scrambled to get back to shore as quickly as possible. I could hear the frantic splashing of oars, the revving of outboard motors pushed to their limits. We made it to the bank in record time, hauling our boats onto the pebbly shore with shaking hands. As we caught our breath, wide-eyed and trembling, I did a quick head count. 5 pale, shocked faces stared back at me. We were all accounted for, thank God. "What the hell was that?" Tom's son, Jimmy, finally broke the silence. His voice cracked, betraying his fear despite his attempt at bravado. I shook my head, at a loss for words. In all my years on the water, I'd never seen anything like it. My mind raced through possibilities, a giant sturgeon maybe. But even as I thought it, I knew that explanation fell short of what we'd witnessed. Let's just get camp set up," I managed, trying to inject some calm authority into my voice. "We'll figure it out in the morning." No one argued. We went about setting up tents and gathering firewood with mechanical efficiency, each lost in our own thoughts. As darkness fell, we huddled around the campfire, jumping at every rustle in the underbrush, every splash from the lake. Sleep was elusive that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that impossible shape rising from the water. The others tossed and turned in their tents, occasional whispers and muffled sobs breaking the eerie silence of the forest. I must have dozed off eventually, because I was jolted awake by a scream. Scrambling out of my tent, I saw Jimmy pointing toward the lake, his face ashen in the pre-dawn light. Our boats were gone, not just adrift, gone. The ropes we'd used to secure them had been cleanly severed, leaving behind only frayed ends on the shore. A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the group as the implications sank in. We were stranded, miles from the nearest road, with no way to call for help, and something was out there, something that had taken our only means of escape. "We need to leave," Mike said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Now, before it comes back." I wanted to argue, to say we should wait for daylight, but one look at the terrified faces around me, and I knew it was pointless. We hastily packed what we could carry and set off into the forest, following the faint trail we'd used to reach the lake. The journey back was a nightmare. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every sound sent our hearts racing. We stumbled through the underbrush, scratched and bleeding, driven by a primal fear that overwhelmed all reason. It was mid-afternoon when we finally broke through the tree line and onto the gravel road where we'd left the van. The relief was palpable. A collective exhale as we piled into the vehicle. I gunned the engine, tires spitting gravel as we sped away from Shadow Lake. We drove in silence for a long time, each processing what we'd experienced in our own way. It was Tom who finally spoke up. "We can't tell anyone about this," he said quietly. "They'll think we're crazy. Or worse, they'll want to go looking for it." There were murmurs of agreement from the others. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. Part of me wanted to argue, to say we had a responsibility to report what we'd seen. But another part, a deeper, more primal part, knew Tom was right. In the days and weeks that followed, I struggled to make sense of what had happened at Shadow Lake. I pored over cryptozoology websites, delved into local legends, even reached out to a marine biologist friend under the guise of research for a book. But no explanation ever fully satisfied me. I never guided another trip to Shadow Lake. In fact, I sold my business and moved away from the area entirely, unable to shake the feeling that something ancient and terrible had awakened in those waters. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees just right, I can almost hear that low, rumbling sound again. And in my dreams, I see that impossible shape breaching the surface, a reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. The others and I made a pact never to speak of what we saw that day, but I break that silence now, not to sensationalize or to seek answers, but as a warning. There are wild places left in this world, places where the line between legend and reality blurs. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we stumble into them unprepared. Shadow Lake keeps its secrets hidden away in the depths of the wilderness, and perhaps that's for the best. Some mysteries, I've learned, are better left unsolved. Story 12. I've always found solace in the chirping of birds, but on that fateful day in the Appalachian wilderness, a single whistle changed everything I thought I knew about nature and myself. As an avid birdwatcher, I'd spent countless weekends exploring various trails and forests, cataloging species, and reveling in the peace that comes from communing with nature. This particular Saturday in late September promised to be perfect. Crisp autumn air, clear skies, and the promise of spotting some rare migratory birds passing through the area. I set out at dawn, my trusty binoculars around my neck, and a well-worn field guide in my pack. The trail I'd chosen was a lesser-known one, winding deep into a secluded valley that few hikers ever ventured into, perfect for undisturbed bird-watching. The morning passed in a blur of colorful plumage and excited scribbles in my notebook. I'd already spotted 3 species I'd never seen in person before, including a pair of cerulean warblers that had me grinning like a child on Christmas morning. It was just after noon when I heard it, a whistle unlike any bird call I'd ever encountered. It was low and melodious, almost hauntingly beautiful, but with an undercurrent of something off. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Intrigued and slightly unnerved, I paused to listen more carefully. The whistle came again, this time from a different direction. I turned, trying to pinpoint its source, but the sound seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. My rational mind raced through possibilities, a new species, some kind of atmospheric phenomenon. But a deeper, more primal part of me knew that this was something else entirely. Curiosity overrode caution, and I found myself moving off the trail, following the intermittent whistles deeper into the forest. The undergrowth grew thicker, the trees closer together, until I could barely see the sky through the canopy above. I'm not sure how long I walked, my sense of time distorted by the strange twilight beneath the dense foliage. The whistle grew louder, more insistent, pulling me forward like a siren's call. Suddenly, I broke through into a small clearing. The whistling stopped abruptly, leaving an unnatural silence in its wake. It took my eyes a moment to adjust to the brighter light, but when they did, I froze in disbelief. There, on the other side of the clearing, stood a figure that defied explanation. It was tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, covered in shaggy, dark fur. But it wasn't the size that struck me most. It was the face. A bizarre blend of ape and man, with deep-set eyes that held an unmistakable intelligence. For a long moment, we simply stared at each other. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body refused to move. The creature tilted its head, regarding me with what I could only describe as curiosity. Then, slowly, deliberately, it raised a massive hand to its mouth and whistled, the same haunting melody that had led me here. My mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you wanted to call it, these were myths. Campfire stories, not flesh and blood creatures standing in front of me in broad daylight. I must have made some small movement, a flinch or a step back, because suddenly the creature's demeanor changed. It dropped into a crouch, lips pulling back to reveal surprisingly human-like teeth. A low growl rumbled from its chest, a sound that vibrated through the clearing and chilled me to my core. Panic finally broke through my paralysis. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no thought for direction or stealth. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me at every step, but terror drove me forward. I could hear it behind me, moving through the forest with impossible speed and grace for something so large. The whistle came again, this time with an almost mocking tone that spurred me to even greater speed. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning, reduced to the pounding of my heart and the burning in my lungs. Eventually, I burst out onto the main trail, nearly colliding with a startled couple out for an afternoon hike. "Whoa there!" the man exclaimed, steadying me as I stumbled. "Are you all right?" I tried to speak, to warn them, but all that came out was a series of gasping breaths. The woman looked alarmed, already reaching for a water bottle in her pack. "Should we call someone?" she asked her companion. "He looks like he's in shock." As my breathing slowly steadied, I glanced back at the forest behind me. There was no sign of pursuit, no hint of the terror I'd just fled from. Had I imagined it all? But no. My clothes were torn, scratches on my arms stinging as the adrenaline began to fade, and there, clutched in my hand so tightly my knuckles were white, was my notebook. Flipping it open with trembling fingers, I saw a hastily scrawled sketch, a rough outline of a face that was neither fully human nor animal. I'm okay," I finally managed, my voice hoarse. "Just got a little turned around on one of the side trails. Thank you for your concern." They didn't look entirely convinced, but after a few more assurances and a couple of sips from the offered water bottle, they continued on their way. I waited until they were out of sight before sinking to the ground, my back against a tree. trying to process what had just happened. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, I made my way back to the trailhead on shaky legs. Each snapping twig or rustle of leaves sent my heart racing anew. By the time I reached my car, I was a nervous wreck, jumping at shadows and imagining eyes watching me from every dark corner of the forest. That night, as I lay in bed unable to sleep, the whistle echoed in my mind. It was beautiful and terrifying, a siren call of the unknown. I knew with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified me that I would return to those woods. In the days and weeks that followed, I threw myself into research. I devoured books on cryptozoology, pored over local legends, and spent countless hours scouring online forums for similar encounters. The more I learned, the more questions I had. I made several return trips to the area, each time venturing a little further off the main trail. I never saw the creature again, but sometimes, when the wind was just right, I could swear I heard that haunting whistle in the distance. My friends and family began to worry. I'd always been passionate about birdwatching, but this new obsession was different. I grew distant, spending more and more time alone in the woods. My job suffered, relationships strained, but I couldn't let it go. The encounter had opened my eyes to a world beyond what I thought I knew, and I was desperate to understand. It was on my fifth expedition, nearly 2 months after the initial encounter, that things changed again. I had set up camp in a small clearing, not far from where I'd first seen the creature. As night fell, I sat by my campfire, senses alert for any unusual sounds. The whistle, when it came, was so close it made me jump. It was behind me, just at the edge of the firelight. Slowly, heart in my throat, I turned. There it stood, the same impossible figure from that first day, but this time there was no fear, no urge to run. Perhaps I had gone mad, or perhaps I had simply accepted that there were things in this world beyond my understanding. The creature regarded me for a long moment, then slowly extended its hand. In its massive palm lay a single feather, iridescent and unlike any I'd ever seen before. As I reached out to take it, our eyes met. In that moment, I understood that this was not just a chance encounter, but an invitation. An invitation to step beyond the boundaries of the known world and into something far greater and more mysterious. I'd like to say I hesitated, that I considered the life I'd be leaving behind, but the truth is, I didn't even look back. I stood, picked up my pack, and followed the creature into the darkness of the forest. I haven't returned to civilization since that night. My family probably thinks I'm dead, another hiker lost to the wilderness. But the truth is, I've never felt more alive. There are wonders in this world that most will never see, secrets whispered in whistles on the wind, and for those willing to listen, willing to step off the beaten path, a whole new world awaits. So if you're ever hiking in the Appalachians and hear a strange, beautiful whistle in the woods, ask yourself, are you ready to answer its call? Story 13. I've spent half my life guiding ships to safety, but on that stormy night, the light I saw in the forest threatened to lead me into darkness. For 15 years, I'd been the keeper of the Crescent Point Lighthouse, perched on the rugged cliffs of the Oregon coast. It was a solitary life, but one I'd grown to love. The rhythmic flash of the beacon, the crash of waves against the rocks, the cry of seagulls, these were my constants in a world of change. That autumn had been particularly stormy, with gale-force winds and rain that seemed to fall sideways more often than not. I'd grown used to the howling of the wind, the way it made the old lighthouse creak and groan like a living thing. It was on one such night, as I made my routine check of the equipment, that I first noticed the lights. At first, I thought it was just a reflection, a trick of the rain-streaked windows, but as I peered out into the darkness, I saw them again, faint, flickering lights deep in the forest that stretched behind the lighthouse. Curiosity piqued. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and raincoat and stepped out into the storm. The wind nearly knocked me off my feet, and the rain stung my face like tiny needles. but those strange lights drew me forward, a moth to a flame. As I entered the tree line, the roar of the storm diminished, muffled by the dense canopy above. The forest was pitch black, my flashlight beam barely penetrating the gloom. I stumbled over roots and rocks, the unfamiliar terrain a stark contrast to the well-worn paths around the lighthouse. The light seemed to dance just at the edge of my vision, always moving, always just out of reach. I pressed on, driven by a compulsion I couldn't explain. Time lost all meaning as I wandered deeper into the woods, the lighthouse far behind me now. Suddenly, I broke through into a small clearing. The lights were gone, but in their place was something that made my blood run cold. Trees had been uprooted and tossed aside like matchsticks, forming a rough circle. In the center of this destruction stood a single, massive oak, its trunk scarred with deep gouges that looked disturbingly like claw marks. As I approached the oak, my flashlight beam caught something metallic at its base. Kneeling down, I brushed away leaves and debris to reveal a small, tarnished plaque. The inscription was worn but still legible. "Here lies the beast of Crescent Point. May it slumber for 1,000 years." The date on the plaque was 1823, exactly 200 years ago. A twig snapped behind me, and I whirled around, my heart pounding. The beam of my flashlight swept across the clearing, revealing nothing but shadows and mist, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a sound that bypassed all rational thought and spoke directly to the most primal part of my brain. "Run," it said, "run now." I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted, crashing through the underbrush with no thought for direction or stealth. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but terror drove me forward. The growl came again, closer this time, accompanied by the sound of something large moving through the forest behind me. Whatever it was fast, and it was gaining. I burst out of the tree line, the lighthouse looming before me like a sanctuary. I sprinted across the open ground, my lungs burning, legs pumping furiously. Just as I reached the door, I heard a roar that shook the very air around me. I slammed the door shut behind me, fumbling with trembling hands to throw the heavy iron bolt. For a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart and my ragged breathing. Then came a thud against the door, so forceful it made the hinges creak. I scrambled up the spiral staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. Another impact shook the lighthouse, and I heard the splintering of wood. Whatever was out there, the door wouldn't hold it for long. I reached the lamp room, my safe haven at the top of the lighthouse. The massive Fresnel lens rotated slowly, casting its beam out to sea. I'd never been so grateful for its steady, comforting presence. As I caught my breath, I became aware of an eerie silence. The battering at the door had stopped. Had it given up? I moved to the windows, peering out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. Then a movement caught my eye. Something was climbing the outside of the lighthouse, its massive form silhouetted against the stormy sky. I caught glimpses of fur, of claws that dug into the stone as if it were clay. I backed away from the windows, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't exist in the real world. But the scratching of claws on stone was all too real, growing louder as the creature neared the top of the lighthouse. In desperation, I turned to the only weapon I had, light. I adjusted the Fresnel lens, focusing its powerful beam directly downward. Just as a massive, clawed hand gripped the edge of the walkway outside, I hit the switch. The night lit up like day, and an inhuman shriek of pain split the air. There was a scrabbling sound, then the thud of something heavy hitting the ground far below. I kept the light trained downward, my heart pounding as I waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. Slowly, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving me shaky and exhausted. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, I finally dared to look out. The ground below was empty, save for deep gouges in the earth where something had landed. Leading away from these marks was a trail of destruction, broken bushes, uprooted saplings, heading back into the forest. In the days that followed, I scoured historical records, local legends, anything that might explain what I'd encountered. I found scattered references to a beast of Crescent Point, a creature that had terrorized the area 2 centuries ago. According to the stories, it had been trapped and buried by a group of settlers, but the details were vague. I considered reporting what had happened, but who would believe me? A lighthouse keeper spinning tales of monsters in the woods. I'd be laughed out of town, or worse, relieved of my duties, so I kept silent, but I remained vigilant. Every night as I lit the beacon, I found myself scanning the tree line, watching for any sign of unnatural movement. I reinforced the lighthouse door, stocked up on high-powered flashlights, and never again ventured into the forest after dark. Weeks passed, then months. Life settled back into its familiar routine, but I was changed. I'd glimpsed something beyond the edges of our known world, something ancient and terrible, and I knew it was still out there, waiting. Sometimes, on stormy nights when the wind howls just right, I think I can hear it, a low, rumbling growl that sets my teeth on edge. On those nights, I make sure the beacon shines extra bright, a ward against the darkness that lurks just beyond the light's reach. I often wonder about those flickering lights that led me into the forest that night. Were they some kind of lure, a trap set by the creature? Or were they a warning, an attempt by some unknown force to reveal the truth of what lay hidden in the woods? I may never know the answer, but I do know this. The world is vaster and stranger than most people realize. There are things that lurk in the shadows, ancient beings that remember a time before man walked the earth. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we stumble upon their hiding places. So if you find yourself on this stretch of coast, and you see lights in the forest beyond the lighthouse, heed my warning, stay in the light. For in the darkness, something waits. Something that has awakened from a long slumber, hungry for what it has been denied for 2 centuries. As for me, I'll remain at my post, tending the light that keeps ships safe from the treacherous rocks. But now I know that the beacon serves another purpose, holding back a darkness far more dangerous than any storm-tossed sea. The beast of Crescent Point may sleep again, but it is not gone, and I fear that when it fully awakens, no light may be bright enough to drive it back into the shadows. Story 14, I've been a forest ranger for over a decade, but nothing could have prepared me for that night. The night when the familiar became alien, and the woods I thought I knew turned into a realm of primal fear. It started like any other evening shift at Blackwood National Forest. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. I was settling into my usual routine at the ranger station, a small wooden cabin nestled among towering pines. The scent of fresh coffee mingled with the earthy aroma of the forest as I flipped through the day's reports. Another quiet day, I muttered to myself, taking a sip from my thermos. But as the words left my lips, a chill ran down my spine. In my years of experience, I'd learned that in the wilderness, quiet often precedes chaos. I shook off the feeling and focused on my work. The soft glow of my desk lamp cast long shadows across the room, and the gentle hum of the radio provided a comforting background noise. Outside, the forest was coming alive with its nightly symphony, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. It was close to midnight when I first heard it, a sound that didn't belong. At first, I couldn't quite place it, something between a low growl and a rumbling breath. I paused, coffee mug halfway to my lips, and listened intently. There it was again, louder this time. My instincts kicked in. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch, scanning the tree line. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of forest, but revealed nothing out of the ordinary. Still, that uneasy feeling persisted. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. "Anyone out there?" No response came, save for the sudden silence of the forest. Even the insects had ceased their chirping. That's when I knew something was wrong. In all my years, I'd never experienced the woods fall so completely quiet. I retreated inside, my heart pounding. I radioed dispatch, keeping my voice low. "This is Ranger Sarah Mackenzie at Blackwood Station. Possible disturbance in the area. Requesting backup for a perimeter check." "Copy that, Sarah," came the crackled response. "Units are tied up with a search and rescue op about 30 miles from your location. ETA 45 minutes to an hour. Can it wait?" I hesitated. Every instinct told me not to go out alone, but I also knew it was my job to investigate. "I'll do a quick sweep and report back. If I don't radio in 15 minutes, send someone ASAP." "Understood. Be careful out there, Sarah." Grabbing my gear, flashlight, radio, sidearm, I stepped back out into the night. The air felt heavier somehow, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. I swept my light across the ground, looking for any signs of disturbance. That's when I saw them, footprints, but not like any I'd ever seen before. They were enormous, easily twice the size of my own boot. The impression was deep, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy, but it wasn't just their size that unsettled me, it was their shape. They were vaguely humanoid, but with clear claw marks at the ends of the toes. My breath caught in my throat. I'd heard stories, of course. Every ranger had. Tales of something lurking in the deepest parts of the forest. Something that walked on two legs but wasn't human. Most dismissed them as campfire stories or the ramblings of overstressed hikers, but seeing those prints, cold fear gripped my heart. I followed the trail, my flashlight beam shaking slightly as I moved deeper into the woods. The prints led away from the station, towards an area of old-growth forest that was rarely visited. With each step, the undergrowth grew thicker, the shadows deeper. A twig snapped somewhere to my left. I whirled, my light cutting through the darkness. For a split second, I thought I saw movement, a flash of something large and dark between the trees, but when I focused, there was nothing there. "Hello!" I called out again, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "This is Ranger Mackenzie. If there's someone out there, please identify yourself." The forest remained silent, but I could feel eyes on me. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I was being watched. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. "Okay, Sarah," I whispered to myself. "Think logically. It's probably just a bear, a very large bipedal bear." Even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Bears didn't move like this. They didn't leave prints like these. And they certainly didn't create this overwhelming sense of intelligent malevolence that seemed to permeate the air. A low growl rumbled through the trees, so deep I felt it in my chest. My hand instinctively went to my sidearm, though I knew it would be useless against whatever was out there. I began to back away slowly, keeping my eyes on the tree line. That's when I saw it, a shape, darker than the surrounding night, moving between the trees. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, with a broad, powerful build. As it moved, I caught glimpses of matted fur and the glint of eyes reflecting my flashlight beam. My training abandoned me. Every survival instinct screamed at me to run, but I stood frozen, unable to look away from the creature that was slowly, deliberately stalking towards me. It stepped into a patch of moonlight, and I had to stifle a scream. The face was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features. Eyes that held an unsettling intelligence glared at me from beneath a heavy brow. Its mouth, filled with sharp teeth, curled into what I could only describe as a grin. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. My mind raced, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew to be possible. This thing, this creature, shouldn't exist. Yet here it was, mere yards away, studying me with predatory intensity. Slowly, deliberately, it raised a massive, clawed hand and pointed directly at me. The message was clear. I had been marked. That broke the spell. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't slow down. Behind me, I could hear the creature giving chase, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. I burst out of the tree line near my station, gasping for air. Without looking back, I sprinted for the door, fumbling with my keys. Just as I heard the creature emerging from the forest, I managed to get inside, slamming the door shut and engaging every lock. Trembling, I grabbed the radio. "Dispatch, this is Mackenzie. I need immediate backup at Blackwood Station. There's something out here, something big." "Copy, Sarah. Units are en route. Can you describe the threat?" I opened my mouth to respond, but how could I explain what I'd seen? They'd think I was crazy. Hell, I thought I was crazy. Before I could formulate a response, a thunderous impact shook the entire station. Wood splintered as massive claws raked down the door. I scrambled away, seeking refuge behind my desk. "It's trying to get in!" I shouted into the radio. "Please hurry!" Another impact. The windows rattled in their frames. I could hear the wood of the door starting to give way. In desperation, I drew my sidearm, knowing it would be useless against the beast outside, but needing to do something. The assault on the door stopped suddenly. An eerie silence fell over the station. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound of movement outside. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. Then, a new sound, a low, guttural vocalization that was almost speech. It was coming from just outside the window nearest my desk. Slowly, I raised my head to peer out. Two eyes, glowing with an otherworldly light, stared back at me from mere inches away. The creature's breath fogged the glass as it studied me. I saw intelligence in those eyes, ancient, predatory, but undeniably sentient. It raised a massive hand and pressed it against the window. The glass creaked under the pressure but held. 5 clawed fingers splayed out, easily dwarfing my own hand. It was a clear message, a promise that this barrier between us was temporary. Just then, I heard the blessed sound of sirens in the distance. The creature's head snapped towards the noise, then back to me. It let out a low growl of what sounded like frustration. With one last, long look at me, it turned and loped back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. Minutes later, a convoy of vehicles pulled up to the station. Fellow rangers and local law enforcement swarmed the area, securing the perimeter and checking on me. I gave them a statement, carefully omitting the more unbelievable aspects of my encounter. I spoke of a large animal, possibly a bear, that had tried to break in. They seemed satisfied with this explanation, attributing my shaken state to the shock of the incident. As dawn broke, casting long shadows through the trees, I stood on the porch of the station. My colleagues were wrapping up their investigation, having found large tracks but no sign of the creature itself. They chalked it up to an unusually aggressive black bear, promising to increase patrols in the area, but I knew the truth. As I gazed into the forest, a chill ran down my spine. Somewhere out there, hidden in the ancient woods, something was watching, waiting, and I had a feeling our paths would cross again. The forest would never be the same for me. The comfort I once found in its familiar paths and sounds was gone, replaced by a constant, nagging fear of what lurked in the shadows. I knew that my encounter that night was just the beginning of something much bigger, a secret the forest had kept hidden for centuries, now awakened and aware of my presence. As my fellow rangers prepared to leave, one of them clasped my shoulder. "You okay, Sarah? You look like you've seen a ghost." I managed a weak smile. "Just tired," I lied. "Long night." But as I watched the sun rise over the treetops, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The line between the world I knew and a darker hues, more primeval reality had blurred, and I was now irrevocably part of that hidden world, whether I wanted to be or not. The forest kept its secrets, but now I was one of them. And somewhere in the depths of Blackwood, I knew that creature was still out there, watching, waiting. For what? I didn't know, but I had a feeling I would find out, sooner or later. Story 15. I never thought our anniversary camping trip would turn into a nightmare. But here we are, huddled in our tent, praying for dawn while something massive prowls just beyond the thin fabric walls. It was supposed to be romantic. Jenny and I had been planning this trip to Yellowstone for months. We're both busy professionals, me a software engineer, her a pediatrician, and quality time together is precious. So when our 5th anniversary rolled around, we decided to disconnect from the world and reconnect with each other in one of America's most beautiful wildernesses. The first 2 days were perfect. We hiked through pristine forests, marveled at geothermal wonders, and spent our evenings stargazing by the campfire. Jenny's laughter echoed through the trees as we reminisced about our early dating days. I remember thinking how lucky I was, how perfect everything felt. If only I'd known. It was our 3rd night when everything changed. We'd hiked deeper into the backcountry, seeking a more secluded spot. As the sun began to set, we found a small clearing nestled between towering pines. It was picturesque, a babbling stream nearby, a carpet of wildflowers, the kind of place you'd see on a postcard. "This is it," Jenny said, her eyes sparkling. "Our own little slice of paradise." I grinned, pulling her close for a kiss. Perfect for our last night out here. We set up camp with practiced ease, our tent a cozy haven against the encroaching darkness. After a simple dinner of dehydrated camping meals, romantic I know, we settled by our small campfire. The flames cast dancing shadows across Jenny's face as she roasted a marshmallow. "Hey," she said softly, leaning against my shoulder. "Thanks for this. It's been amazing." I wrapped an arm around her, breathing in the scent of pine and wood smoke. "Anything for you, babe. Happy anniversary." As the fire died down to embers, we retreated to our tent. The air had grown chilly, and we snuggled close in our double sleeping bag. Jenny's breathing soon evened out into sleep, but I lay awake for a while, listening to the night sounds of the forest. It was peaceful at first. The gentle rustle of wind through leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. But then something changed. I couldn't put my finger on what exactly, but a sense of unease crept over me. The forest had grown too quiet. I was about to wake Jenny when I heard it. A cracking sound, like a branch breaking under a heavy weight. Then another, and another. Something large was moving through the woods, headed in our direction. My heart began to race. Bears were common in Yellowstone, and we'd taken all the proper precautions with our food. But this didn't sound like a bear. The footsteps were too deliberate, almost bipedal. I gently shook Jenny awake. "Honey," I whispered, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "I think there's something out there." She blinked awake, confusion turning to concern as she registered my expression. "What do you mean?" she whispered back. Before I could answer, a low growl rumbled through the air. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, deeper than a bear, with an almost human-like quality that sent chills down my spine. Jenny's eyes widened in fear. She gripped my arm tightly as we both strained to listen. The footsteps drew closer, circling our campsite. Whatever it was big. I could hear its labored breathing, smell a musky animal odor that seeped through the tent walls. "Mike," Jenny breathed, her voice barely audible. What is that?" I shook my head, at a loss for words. My mind raced through possibilities: bear, moose, elk, but none quite fit. This was something else entirely. Suddenly, a shadow fell across our tent. Something massive was standing just outside, its form silhouetted against the moonlight. I held my breath, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure the creature could hear it. The shadow moved, and I caught a glimpse of a hand. No, not a hand, a paw, with long, curved claws. It was easily twice the size of my own hand. My blood ran cold as I realized we were dealing with something beyond my worst nightmares. Jenny whimpered softly, burying her face in my chest. I wrapped my arms around her, my eyes fixed on the tent wall, watching the shadow's every move. For what felt like hours, the creature circled our tent. Occasionally Curry would pause, and we'd hear deep, rumbling breaths as it seemed to scent the air. Each time it drew near, I was certain it would rip through the thin fabric and drag us into the night, but it didn't. It just watched, waited, for what? I couldn't imagine. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to battle with terror. Jenny drifted into a fitful sleep, but I remained vigilant. The creature's presence was constant, a looming threat that refused to leave. In those long, dark hours, my mind conjured all sorts of wild theories. Was this some undiscovered species, a government experiment gone wrong, or something more supernatural? I'd never believed in cryptids or monsters, but faced with this inexplicable presence, I found my skepticism wavering. Just before dawn, the creature let out a long, mournful howl that echoed through the trees. It was a sound of ancient loneliness, of something that didn't quite belong in this world. Then, with heavy footsteps, it retreated into the forest. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, Jenny and I cautiously emerged from our tent. The campsite was a mess. Deep footprints surrounded our tent, each one larger than both of my feet combined. Claw marks scored nearby trees, higher than I could reach. And there, at the edge of the clearing, was a tuft of coarse, dark hair snagged on a branch. "Mike," Jenny said, her voice shaking. What was that thing?" I shook my head, still struggling to process what had happened. "I don't know, honey, but I think we should pack up and get out of here, fast." We broke camp in record time, constantly looking over our shoulders. As we shouldered our packs, a twig snapped in the forest. We both froze, staring wide-eyed into the green shadows between the trees. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a tall, hulking figure covered in dark fur. But when I blinked, it was gone. A trick of the light, surely. It had to be. "Let's go," I said, taking Jenny's hand. We practically ran down the trail, not slowing until we reached the ranger station hours later. We debated whether to report what we'd seen. In the harsh light of day, it all seemed so implausible. What would we even say? That we were stalked by some giant, unknown creature? They'd think we were crazy. Or worse, hoaxers looking for attention. In the end, we said nothing. We checked out of the park, climbed into our car, and drove home in near silence, both lost in our own thoughts. But that night has haunted us ever since. We've researched cryptids, pored over local legends, even reached out anonymously to others who claim to have had similar encounters. The more we learn, the more questions we have. Sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls outside our bedroom window, I find myself transported back to that tent in Yellowstone. I feel the presence of something ancient and powerful, watching from just beyond the veil of our understood reality. Jenny and I don't camp anymore. Our anniversaries are spent in well-lit restaurants or cozy bed and breakfasts, but we both know that our experience changed us forever. We've glimpsed something that most people never will, a reminder that the world is vaster and more mysterious than we can imagine. As for what exactly stalked us that night in Yellowstone, I still don't have a name for it. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, some unknown species, or just the product of two overactive imaginations in a dark forest. I don't know, but I do know this. Something was out there, something that defied explanation. And somewhere in the vast wilderness of Yellowstone, it's still there, waiting, watching, a reminder that there are still mysteries in this world, and some of them have teeth and claws. Jenny stirs beside me as I write this, a frown creasing her brow in sleep. I wonder if she's dreaming of that night, of the shadows and the howls and the feeling of being prey. I close my laptop and lie down, pulling her close. As I drift off to sleep, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, in the dark spaces between civilization, something is looking up at the same moon and remembering us too. Tomorrow, we'll go back to our normal lives. We'll be the successful, rational professionals everyone sees us as. But we'll carry this secret with us, this glimpse into a world beyond our understanding. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you're in the woods and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, that sense of being watched, remember our story, because you never know what might be lurking just beyond the firelight, waiting to remind you that the world is far stranger and more wonderful than you ever imagined. Story 16. I never thought I'd be grateful for the light of my phone's dying battery, but as I huddled in the back of this cave, it was the only thing keeping the darkness, and what lurked within it, at bay. It wasn't supposed to be like this. We were just a group of friends on a weekend hiking trip in the Colorado Rockies. 5 of us, me, Jake, Sarah, Mike, and Lisa, all experienced hikers looking for a challenge off the beaten path. We'd done trips like this before, always coming back with great stories and even better photos for our Instagram feeds. But this time was different. This time, we made a mistake. It started innocently enough. We'd been hiking for most of the day, the majestic peaks of the Rockies surrounding us on all sides. The weather had been perfect, clear blue skies, a gentle breeze, the kind of day that makes you feel invincible. "Hey guys," Mike called out, pointing to a narrow trail branching off from our planned route. "What do you say we check that out? Might lead to an awesome viewpoint." We should have known better. We should have stuck to our planned route, the one we'd left with our emergency contacts. But the day had been going so well, and we were all riding that high that comes from being young and in nature. So we took the trail. At first, it was exhilarating. The path wound through dense forest, occasionally opening up to reveal breathtaking vistas of the surrounding mountains. We were making good time, joking and laughing as we went, but as the afternoon wore on, things started to change. The trail became less defined, often disappearing completely only to reappear yards away. The trees grew thicker, blocking out more and more of the sunlight, and then, almost imperceptibly at first, fog began to roll in. "Guys," Sarah said, a note of concern in her voice, "I think we should turn back. This doesn't feel right." She was right, of course, but by then none of us were entirely sure which way back was. The fog had thickened rapidly, reducing visibility to mere feet in front of us. The temperature had dropped, and an eerie silence had fallen over the forest. "Let's check the GPS," Jake suggested, pulling out his phone. His face fell as he looked at the screen. No signal, damn. We all checked our phones. Nothing. We were completely cut off. "Okay, don't panic," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We'll just backtrack as best we can. We're bound to hit the main trail eventually." But as the light faded and the fog thickened, it became clear that we were hopelessly lost. Every tree looked the same in the mist, every rock and bush a potential landmark that ultimately led nowhere. Night fell quickly in the mountains, and with it came a bone-chilling cold. We huddled together, using our flashlights sparingly to conserve battery life. That's when we heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "What was that?" Lisa whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Probably just the wind," Mike said, but his voice lacked conviction. We pressed on, desperate to find shelter or a way out of this nightmare. That's when Jake spotted it, a dark opening in the side of the mountain. A cave. "We should rest there for the night," he suggested. "Max, at least it'll get us out of this fog." None of us were thrilled about entering a strange cave in the middle of nowhere, but the alternative, spending the night exposed on the mountainside, seemed worse. So, with great trepidation, we entered. The cave was deeper than we expected, extending back into the mountain. Our flashlights revealed rough stone walls, covered in strange markings. Some looked like claw marks, others almost like crude drawings. But we were too exhausted to pay much attention. We set up a makeshift camp near the entrance, promising ourselves we'd find our way out at first light. I'm not sure what woke me. Maybe it was the cold, or the hard stone beneath me. But as I opened my eyes, I realized 2 things simultaneously. Our flashlights had died, plunging the cave into pitch darkness, and something was moving in the back of the cave. I fumbled for my phone, my heart pounding. The screen's light was painfully bright after the darkness, but it was enough to see by, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Bones. Scattered across the cave floor were bones of all sizes, some clearly animal, others disturbingly human-like. And there, on the wall next to me, was a handprint, but not like any handprint I'd ever seen. It was massive, easily twice the size of my own hand, with long, curved claw marks extending from each finger. A low growl emanated from the depths of the cave, snapping me back to reality. I shook my friends awake, trying to keep my voice low. "We need to get out of here, now." They stirred groggily, but the urgency in my voice quickly cut through their sleepiness. We gathered our things as quietly as possible, all too aware of the sounds coming from deeper in the cave, the scrape of claws on stone, the rustle of movement, and that persistent, rumbling growl. We were almost to the cave entrance when Mike's foot caught on a loose stone. He stumbled, knocking over our makeshift water bottle collection. The clatter echoed through the cave like a gunshot. Everything went silent for a moment. Then from the darkness behind us came a roar that shook the very ground beneath our feet. "Run!" I yelled, all pretense of stealth abandoned. We burst out of the cave into the pre-dawn gloom. The fog had lifted somewhat, revealing a landscape bathed in shadows. Behind us, something large was emerging from the cave, something that moved on two legs, but was far too big to be human. We ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. The creature pursued, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. Trees crashed behind us as it plowed through the forest with terrifying speed. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that mad dash for survival. But eventually, mercifully, we broke through the tree line onto a wider trail. In the distance, we could see lights, a ranger station. We didn't stop running until we reached the station, collapsing on the front porch in a heap of exhaustion and terror. The rangers were understandably shocked, but they quickly called for medical help and alerted search and rescue about our ordeal. As dawn broke, casting long shadows across the mountains, a team was assembled to investigate our claims. They found the cave easily enough. Our frantic trail wasn't hard to follow, but of the creature that chased us, they found no sign, no footprints, no fur, nothing but our wild stories and pale, frightened faces. We were lucky, they told us. We could have died out there, lost in the wilderness, and maybe they're right. Maybe it was all just a product of fear and exhaustion, our minds playing tricks on us in the darkness. But I know what I saw. I know what chased us through that forest. And sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls outside my window, I find myself back in that cave. I feel the cold stone beneath me, smell the musty air, and hear that terrible growl echoing from the darkness. We don't talk about that night much, the five of us. We've drifted apart, each dealing with the trauma in our own way. But we're bonded by a shared secret, a glimpse into a world that most people will never see or believe. I still hike occasionally, but never far from marked trails. And I always leave a detailed plan of my route with someone I trust, because I know now that the wilderness holds secrets, ancient, terrifying secrets that are better left undisturbed. As for what exactly was in that cave, I don't have a name for it. Wendigo, skinwalker, or just some undiscovered predator. In the end, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that it's out there, somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Rockies, waiting, watching. A reminder that we are not always the apex predator, and that there are some mysteries that should remain unsolved. So the next time you're in the mountains and you hear a strange sound echoing through the trees, or feel eyes watching you from the shadows, remember our story. And maybe, just maybe, stick to the marked trails, because you never know what might be lurking just beyond the reach of your flashlight, waiting to remind you that the world is far more mysterious and dangerous than you ever imagined. Story 17. I've captured countless images of nature's beauty, but it's the photo I didn't take that haunts me, the one that could have proved everything. If only I'd had the courage to lift my camera instead of running for my life. My name's Tom Callahan, and I've been a wildlife photographer for the better part of 2 decades. I've trekked through jungles, deserts, and tundras, always searching for that perfect shot. But nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for what I encountered in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. It was supposed to be a routine assignment, capturing the autumn colors in Olympic National Park for a nature magazine. I'd been there before, knew the best spots for sweeping vistas and intimate woodland scenes. This time, though, I wanted something different, something that would make my editor sit up and take notice. That's what led me off the main trails, deep into the old-growth forest where few hikers ventured. The trees here were ancient giants, their moss-covered trunks disappearing into a canopy that filtered the sunlight into a perpetual twilight. I'd been hiking for hours, occasionally stopping to set up my tripod and capture the play of light and shadow among the ferns and fallen logs. As the day wore on, I found myself in a part of the forest I didn't recognize. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches creating strange, almost humanoid shapes in my peripheral vision. That's when I saw the tracks. At first, I thought they must belong to a bear. They were certainly large enough, but as I knelt to examine them more closely, my breath caught in my throat. These weren't bear tracks. The shape was all wrong, more elongated, with distinct toe impressions that looked disturbingly human-like, and they were huge, easily twice the size of my own boot print. My heart began to race as I considered the implications. Could this be evidence of the legendary Bigfoot? I'd always been skeptical of cryptid stories, dismissing them as folklore or misidentified bear sightings. But seeing these tracks, perfectly preserved in the soft forest loam, made me question everything I thought I knew. I quickly set up my camera, capturing several shots of the prints from various angles. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet, the usual bird song and rustle of small animals conspicuously absent. Just as I was packing up my gear, a twig snapped somewhere behind me. I whirled around, my hand instinctively going to the bear spray on my belt, but there was nothing there, just shadows and silence. I should have left then, should have headed back to the safety of the marked trails and my rented cabin, but the lure of potentially capturing proof of a cryptid's existence was too strong. So instead, I decided to follow the tracks. They led me deeper into the forest, to areas where the underbrush grew thick and tangled. The light was fading fast, but I pressed on, using my headlamp to illuminate the way. The tracks remained clear, leading me on like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. Then I entered a clearing, and my blood ran cold. The trees here had been devastated. Massive trunks lay splintered and broken, as if they'd been snapped like twigs. Deep gouges scored the bark of those still standing, higher than any bear could reach. And there, in the center of the destruction, was a half-eaten deer carcass. I approached cautiously, my camera at the ready. The deer's ribcage had been torn open with incredible force, and long claw marks raked its flanks. This was no ordinary predator kill. Whatever had done this possessed strength far beyond any known animal in these woods. As I knelt to examine the carcass, a sound froze me in place. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was deeper than a bear's, with an almost human-like quality that sent chills down my spine. Slowly, I turned, and that's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing stood a figure that defied explanation. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. But it wasn't the size that terrified me. It was the eyes. Glowing in the beam of my headlamp were 2 very intelligent, very angry eyes. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I could see its chest heaving with each breath, could smell a musky animal odor on the wind. My mind raced, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew to be possible. Then it moved, and the spell was broken. With a roar that shook the very ground, the creature charged. I didn't think, didn't plan, I just ran. Crashing through the underbrush, my camera banging against my chest, I fled in blind panic. Behind me, I could hear trees cracking as the beast pursued, its footfalls shaking the earth. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out. Branches whipped at my face. Roots seemed to reach up to trip me, but I didn't slow down. The creature's presence was a constant, terrifying pressure at my back. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I burst out onto a trail. In the distance, I could see lights, my rental cabin. With a final burst of speed, I sprinted towards safety. I slammed the door behind me, locking it with trembling hands. For long minutes, I stood there, gasping for breath, straining to hear any sound of pursuit. But there was nothing, just the normal sounds of the forest night. As the adrenaline faded, I became aware of a warm trickle down my face. Touching my cheek, my hand came away bloody. I must have cut myself on a branch during my frantic flight. My clothes were torn, caked with mud and leaf litter. It wasn't until I went to clean up that I realized my camera was gone. In my panic, I must have dropped it somewhere in the woods. With it went any proof of what I'd seen, the tracks, the destroyed clearing, and maybe, just maybe, a glimpse of the creature itself. I debated whether to report what had happened. In the harsh light of day, it all seemed so implausible. What would I say? That I was chased by Bigfoot? They'd think I was crazy, or worse, trying to pull some kind of hoax. In the end, I said nothing. I checked out early, telling the rental office I wasn't feeling well. On the long drive home, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Had it all been some kind of stress-induced hallucination? A bear made monstrous by fear and fading light? But I knew the truth. The image of those intelligent eyes staring at me across the clearing was burned into my memory. Whatever I had encountered out there was real, and it was something science couldn't explain. I've been back to Olympic National Park several times since that day, always with the intention of finding that clearing again, of gathering proof. But the forest seems different now, as if it's deliberately hiding its secrets. I've never been able to retrace my steps to that fateful spot. Sometimes, on sleepless nights, I find myself poring over maps of the park, trying to pinpoint where I might have been. I've reached out anonymously to other hikers and photographers who claim to have had similar encounters. Their stories send chills down my spine, not because they're frightening, but because of how familiar they sound. I still work as a wildlife photographer, but something has changed. Every time I set up my camera in a remote location, I feel eyes on me. Every snapping twig or rustle in the underbrush makes my heart race. I'm always aware that just beyond the reach of my lens, something might be watching, waiting. The shot I didn't take that day in Olympic National Park could have changed everything. It could have proven the existence of a creature that science says is impossible. But in that moment of terror and awe, survival instinct overrode professional curiosity. Do I regret running? Sometimes. The chance to definitively prove the existence of a cryptid is the dream of every wildlife photographer. But then I remember the raw power in that roar, the intelligence in those eyes, and I know I made the right choice. Whatever I encountered that day, it made one thing clear. The natural world is far more mysterious and dangerous than we like to believe. There are things out there, creatures that defy explanation, living just beyond the edge of our understanding. So the next time you're hiking in a remote forest and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, that sense of being watched, remember my story. And maybe, just maybe, think twice before trying to capture that perfect shot. Because some things in nature aren't meant to be photographed. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 18. I always thought the scariest things in the wilderness were bears or mountain lions, but after what happened on that solo hike in Olympic National Park, I realized the true terrors are the ones we can't explain. My name is Emily, and I've been an avid hiker for years. There's something about the solitude of the trail, the challenge of pushing your body to its limits, that I find irresistible. So when I had a week off work, I decided to tackle a lesser-known trail in the heart of Olympic National Park. I'd done my research, packed all the essentials, and left a detailed plan with my sister. I was prepared for everything, or so I thought. The first 2 days were everything I'd hoped for. The trail wound through ancient forests, past crystal-clear streams, and up to breathtaking vistas. I reveled in the solitude, not having seen another hiker since I left the trailhead. It was on the third day that things began to change. I woke early, eager to cover some miles before the heat of the day set in. As I broke camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The usual morning chorus of birdsong was absent, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press in from all sides. Shaking off my unease, I shouldered my pack and set off down the trail. That's when I first noticed the tracks. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Massive, easily twice the size of my own boot print, with a shape that was disturbingly human-like. But no human could leave prints that large, or that deep in the hard-packed earth of the trail. My first thought was bear, but these were clearly bipedal tracks. They followed the trail for a while before veering off into the dense underbrush. Against my better judgment, I found myself following them. The forest seemed to grow darker and more oppressive as I moved away from the main trail. The trees here were older, their gnarled branches reaching out like grasping fingers. I tried to focus on the tracks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A twig snapped somewhere to my left, and I whirled around, heart pounding. There was nothing there, just shadows and silence, but as I turned back to the trail, I caught a glimpse of something moving just at the edge of my vision, something large and dark and decidedly not human. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling sound that was somewhere between a growl and a human moan. It echoed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to move slowly, carefully making my way back towards the main trail. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I could have sworn I heard heavy breathing just behind me. I picked up my pace, no longer caring about stealth. Branches whipped at my face as I half ran, half stumbled through the underbrush. The sounds behind me grew louder, heavy footfalls and the crack of breaking branches. Just as I thought my lungs would burst, I broke through onto the main trail. I didn't stop to look back, just ran full tilt down the path, my backpack bouncing painfully against my spine. It wasn't until I'd put a good mile between me and whatever that was, that I finally slowed down. Gasping for breath, I leaned against a tree, my legs shaking with exertion and fear. That's when I saw them. More tracks, right there on the main trail. They were fresh, the edges still crisp in the soft earth, and they were headed in the same direction I was going. A cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach. Whatever had made those tracks was between me and the trailhead, between me and safety. For a moment, I considered turning back, trying to find another way out of the park. But I knew these trails were my best chance of getting back to civilization. I had to press on. The rest of that day was a nightmare of paranoia and fear. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide some lurking threat. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, sure that at any moment I would see some monstrous form emerging from the trees. As the day wore on, the signs became harder to ignore. More tracks, some so fresh the displaced dirt hadn't yet settled, strange markings on trees, claw marks far too high for any known predator, and always that feeling of being watched. I pushed on far longer than I should have, not wanting to make camp with that thing out there. But as the light began to fade, I knew I had no choice. I found a small clearing, set up my tent with shaking hands, and tried to convince myself that the noises I heard in the gathering darkness were just normal forest sounds. Sleep was impossible. I lay awake, straining my ears for any sound of approach. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I heard it, heavy footsteps, slowly circling my campsite. I held my breath, praying that the thin fabric of my tent was enough to hide me from whatever was out there. The footsteps paused just outside my tent. I could hear deep, rhythmic breathing, could smell a musky animal odor that seeped through the tent walls. For what felt like hours, I lay there, every muscle tensed, waiting for the moment when claws would tear through the nylon and I would come face to face with my stalker. But the attack never came. Eventually, the breathing faded, the footsteps receded, and I was left alone in the oppressive silence of the forest. When dawn finally broke, I packed up camp in record time, my hands shaking so badly I could barely tie my bootlaces. The tracks were there, just as I'd feared, massive prints that circled my tent, pausing right where I'd heard the breathing. I practically ran down the trail that day, no longer even trying to enjoy the hike. My only goal was to get back to the trailhead, back to my car, back to a world that made sense. But the signs followed me. More tracks, more claw marks, and once, heart-stoppingly, a glimpse of something large and dark moving through the trees parallel to the trail. I quickened my pace, no longer caring about conserving energy or enjoying the scenery. It was late afternoon when I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. A howl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It started low, almost subsonic, before rising to a pitch that set my teeth on edge. It was filled with loneliness, hunger, and something that sounded almost human. That's when I ran. All pretense of hiking abandoned, I sprinted down the trail, my backpack bouncing painfully against my spine. I could hear it behind me, the crack of breaking branches, the thud of heavy footfalls. Whatever it was fast, and it was gaining. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that mad dash for survival. But suddenly, blessedly, I burst out of the trees into the parking lot. My car was there, a beautiful sight of normality and safety. I fumbled with my keys, glancing back at the tree line. For a moment, just a moment, I saw it. A figure, massive and dark, standing just at the edge of the forest. It was too far away to make out details, but I could feel its gaze locked on me. Then I was in my car, engine roaring to life, tires squealing as I peeled out of the parking lot. I didn't slow down until I hit the main highway, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I've tried to rationalize what happened in the days since. Maybe it was a bear, made monstrous by fear and exhaustion. Maybe I was suffering from some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But deep down, I know the truth. What I encountered out there was something beyond explanation, something that shouldn't exist in our rational, ordered world. I've done some research since then, reaching out anonymously to others who claim to have had similar encounters. Their stories send chills down my spine, not because they're frightening, but because of how familiar they sound. The tracks, the howls, the feeling of being watched. I still hike, but never alone and never in Olympic National Park. Sometimes, when I'm on a trail and the forest goes quiet, I feel that old fear creeping back. I find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see a dark shape moving just out of sight. I don't know what I encountered out there, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or something else entirely. The name doesn't really matter. What matters is that it's out there, somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, a reminder that the world is far more mysterious and dangerous than we like to believe. So the next time you're hiking a lonely trail and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, that sense of being watched, remember my story, and maybe, just maybe, stick to the more popular trails. Because some parts of the wilderness are better left unexplored, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 19. I've been a hunter all my life, but that day in the woods turned me into the prey. What started as a routine deer hunting trip became a fight for survival against something that shouldn't exist. My name's Ryan, and I've been hunting these woods with my buddy David since we were kids. We know every trail, every deer run, every hidden meadow, or at least we thought we did. It was a crisp October morning when we set out, the kind of day that makes you glad to be alive and in the wilderness. The leaves were turning, painting the forest in shades of red and gold. A light mist hung in the air, promising good hunting conditions. We'd been out for a couple of hours, moving quietly through our favorite hunting grounds, when we came across something that stopped us in our tracks. "Ryan," David whispered, pointing to a clearing ahead. "What the hell is that?" I followed his gaze, and my blood ran cold. There, in the center of the clearing, was a deer carcass. But this was no ordinary kill. The animal had been torn apart with incredible force. Its ribcage splayed open like a grisly flower. Long, deep gashes ran along its flanks, too big to be from any predator I knew. and the way it was positioned, propped up against a tree as if on display, spoke of an intelligence that sent shivers down my spine. "Mountain lion?" David suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. I shook my head. No cat did this. "Look at the size of those claw marks." We approached cautiously, our rifles at the ready. The coppery smell of blood mixed with something else, a musky animal odor I couldn't place. As we got closer, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. "Dave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "look at the tracks." Surrounding the carcass were footprints unlike anything I'd ever seen. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boot print, and distinctly bipedal. But the shape was all wrong for a human, too wide, with clear claw marks at the end of each toe. "What the hell could have made these?" David breathed, kneeling to examine the prints more closely. Before I could answer, a twig snapped somewhere in the forest behind us. We both whirled around, rifles raised, but there was nothing there, just shadows and silence. That's when I noticed the smell had gotten stronger. That musky, animal odor now seemed to surround us, making the air feel thick and heavy. "We should go," I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "Now," David nodded, his face pale. We backed away from the carcass slowly, our eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. We'd made it about 50 yards when we heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was deeper than a bear's, with an almost human-like quality that sent chills down my spine. "Run," I whispered, and we took off. We crashed through the underbrush, all thoughts of stealth forgotten. Behind us, I could hear something large moving through the forest, branches snapping like twigs under its weight. What is it?" David gasped as we ran. "I don't know," I panted back, "but I don't want to find out." We burst out of the woods into a small meadow, and for a moment I thought we'd lost it. But then I saw them, more tracks, fresh ones, leading right across our path. "It's cutting us off," I realized with a jolt of terror. We changed direction, heading for a ridge we knew led back to our truck. The sound of pursuit was constant now, always just behind us, always getting closer. As we scrambled up the ridge, loose rocks sliding under our feet, I risked a glance back. What I saw nearly made me lose my footing. There, at the edge of the trees, was a shape that defied explanation. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. But it wasn't the size that terrified me. It was the eyes. Glowing in the shadows were 2 very intelligent, very angry eyes. For a moment, it just stood there watching us. Then it let out a roar that shook the very ground and charged. "Go! Go! Go!" I yelled, shoving David ahead of me. We ran like we'd never run before, hearts pounding, lungs burning. The creature was fast, impossibly fast for something so large. I could hear its heavy breathing, smell that musky odor growing stronger. Just when I thought my legs would give out, we crested the ridge. Our truck was there, a beautiful sight of normality and safety. "Keys!" I gasped. David fumbled in his pocket, nearly dropping them in his panic. I snatched them from his hand and all but dove into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, just as something massive slammed into the back of the truck. The whole vehicle rocked, and I heard the screech of tearing metal. I floored it, tires spinning in the dirt before finally finding purchase. As we fishtailed onto the logging road, I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror of a dark shape retreating into the forest. We didn't speak for a long time, both of us trying to process what had just happened. It wasn't until we hit the main highway that David finally broke the silence. What was that thing?" he asked, his voice shaky. I shook my head. "I don't know, man. I really don't know." In the days that followed, we debated whether to report what we'd seen, but who would believe us? We were experienced hunters, not some city folks who might mistake a bear for something more exotic. We knew what we'd encountered was something beyond explanation. We did some research, reaching out anonymously to others who claimed to have had similar encounters in the area. Their stories sent chills down my spine, not because they were frightening, but because of how familiar they sounded. The tracks, the roars, the feeling of being hunted. Some called it Bigfoot, others Sasquatch. The name didn't really matter. What mattered was that it was out there, somewhere in the vast wilderness we'd thought we knew so well. We still hunt, but never in that part of the forest, and never alone. Sometimes, when we're out in the woods and the birds go quiet, I feel that old fear creeping back. I find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see a dark shape moving just out of sight. I've tried to rationalize what happened that day. Maybe it was a bear, made monstrous by fear and adrenaline. Maybe we were suffering from some kind of shared hallucination brought on by tainted water or bad jerky. But deep down, I know the truth. What we encountered out there was something beyond explanation, something that shouldn't exist in our rational, ordered world. It's changed the way I see the wilderness. The forest I once found comforting now holds a hint of menace. Every shadow could be hiding something. Every snapping twig could be a footstep. I've come to realize that we're not always the top predator out there. There are things in the wild places of the world that defy our understanding, creatures that turn hunters into prey. So the next time you're out in the backcountry and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, that sense of being watched, remember our story. And maybe, just maybe, think twice about investigating that strange sound or following those odd tracks. Because some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some hunts are better left unfinished. The wilderness holds secrets, ancient and dangerous ones, and sometimes the price of uncovering those secrets is higher than anyone is willing to pay. I still dream about that day sometimes. I see those intelligent eyes watching me from the shadows, hear that bone-shaking roar echoing through the trees. And I wake up in a cold sweat, grateful for the solid walls around me and the comforting normality of the civilized world. But even as I try to convince myself it was all some kind of mistake, a small part of me knows better. It knows that out there, in the deep woods where few people ever go, something is waiting, watching, and maybe, just maybe, hunting. So if you ever find yourself in those woods and you come across strange tracks or a kill that doesn't look quite right, do yourself a favor. Don't investigate. Don't try to be a hero. Just turn around and get out of there as fast as you can. Because in the real wilderness, in the places untouched by civilization, we're not always the hunters. Sometimes we're the prey. And the things that hunt us there are beyond our worst nightmares. Stay safe out there, folks. And remember, sometimes the best hunt is the one you walk away from. Story 20. I've been on countless search and rescue missions, but none haunt me like the night we searched for little Tommy in the dense forests of Maine. What started as a routine missing child case turned into a nightmare that still keeps me up at night. My name's Jack, and I've been with the Pine County Search and Rescue Team for over a decade. We've had our share of tough cases, but when the call came in about a missing 8-year-old boy in the Baxter State Park area, something felt different right from the start. It was a crisp autumn evening when we assembled at the command post. Tommy had been on a camping trip with his family when he wandered off to explore and never returned. The sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. Time was not on our side. "All right, team, listen up," our coordinator, Sarah, called out. "Tommy's been missing for about 3 hours now. He was last seen wearing a red jacket and blue jeans. Standard search pattern. Keep in radio contact. And remember, these woods get dangerous after dark. Let's bring this boy home." We split into teams and headed out into the forest. I was paired with Mike, a veteran of the force like myself. As we pushed deeper into the woods, the dying light made every shadow seem alive. "You got a bad feeling about this one too, Jack?" Mike asked as we swept our flashlights across the undergrowth. I nodded grimly. "Yeah, something's not right. It's too quiet out here." He was right. The usual chorus of crickets and nocturnal birds was eerily absent. The only sound was the crunch of leaves under our boots and our own labored breathing as we climbed a steep incline. We'd been searching for about an hour when we found the first clue. There, caught on a thorny bush, was a scrap of red fabric. "It's from his jacket," I said. carefully removing it from the branches. We must be on the right track. But as I turned to show Mike, I saw his face had gone pale. He was staring at something on the ground. "Jack," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "look at this." I followed his gaze and felt my blood run cold. There, pressed into the soft earth, was a footprint, but not a child's print. This was massive, easily twice the size of my own boot, and the shape was all wrong, too wide with distinct claw marks at the end of each toe. "What the hell could have made that?" Mike breathed. Before I could answer, a sound echoed through the trees that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was a scream, high-pitched and terrified, but it cut off abruptly, as if something had silenced it. "Tommy!" I yelled, all thoughts of stealth forgotten. We charged in the direction of the scream, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs. The forest seemed to press in around us, branches clawing at our clothes as if trying to hold us back. The beam of my flashlight bounced wildly, creating nightmarish shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. We burst into a small clearing and stopped dead in our tracks. There, in the center, was Tommy's backpack. It was torn to shreds, the contents scattered across the forest floor. But it was what surrounded the backpack that turned my blood to ice. Footprints, dozens of them, the same massive clawed prints we'd seen before, circling the backpack like some kind of macabre dance. And there, leading away from the clearing, was a trail of both the huge prints and smaller ones, child-sized. "My God," Mike whispered. "It's got him." I keyed my radio with shaking hands. "Command, this is Jack. We found evidence of the boy, but there's something else out here, something big. We need backup now." Static was my only answer. The dense forest must have been blocking the signal. "What do we do?" Mike asked, his eyes wide with fear. Every instinct told me to turn back, to run, and never look back, but I couldn't, not with Tommy still out there. "We follow the trail," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Into whatever's got him. We can't let it get away." Mike nodded grimly, and we set off, following the tracks deeper into the darkening forest. The trail led us to areas of the park I'd never seen before. The trees here were older, gnarled and twisted into shapes that seemed almost human in the wavering beam of our flashlights. The ground became soggy underfoot, the air thick with the smell of decay. We'd been following the tracks for what felt like hours when we heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a sound that spoke of ancient hunger and primal rage. Mike and I froze, our flashlights darting from shadow to shadow, trying to locate the source of that terrible sound. That's when I saw it, a pair of eyes reflecting our light, glowing with an unnatural intelligence. They were easily 8 feet off the ground. "Run," I whispered, but it was too late. With a roar that shook the very ground, something massive burst from the underbrush. In the chaotic flashes of our lights, I caught glimpses of matted fur, huge clawed hands, and a face that was a nightmarish blend of bear and man. We ran. Oh God, how we ran! Crashing through the forest, branches whipping our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. Behind us, we could hear the creature in pursuit, trees cracking under its weight as it charged after us. I don't know how long we fled. Time lost all meaning in that frantic race for survival. But suddenly, mercifully, we burst out onto a fire road. Our truck was there, a beautiful sight of normality and safety. We scrambled in, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. Just as the engine roared to life, something slammed into the back of the truck with enough force to shove it forward several feet. I floored it, tires spinning in the mud before finding purchase. As we fishtailed onto the main road, I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror of a massive, dark shape melting back into the forest. We drove in silence for a long time, both of us trying to process what had just happened. It wasn't until we were back in cell range that we finally called it in. The search for Tommy continued for weeks. They found more evidence, shreds of clothing, a shoe, but never the boy himself. The official report cited animal attack, probably a bear, but Mike and I knew the truth. What we encountered out there was something beyond explanation, something that shouldn't exist in our rational, ordered world. I've tried to rationalize it in the years since. Maybe it was a bear, made monstrous by fear and darkness. Maybe we were suffering from some kind of shared hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. But deep down, I know what I saw. Those eyes, that roar, they haunt my dreams to this day. I still work search and rescue, but never in that part of the forest. Sometimes, when I'm out on a mission and the woods go quiet, I feel that old fear creeping back. I find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see a dark shape moving just out of sight. I've come to realize that the wilderness holds secrets, ancient, dangerous secrets that are better left undisturbed. There are things out there in the dark places of the world that turn rescuers into victims, hunters into prey. So the next time you're hiking in the backcountry and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, that sense of being watched, remember our story. And maybe, just maybe, stick to the marked trails and well-lit campsites. Because in the deep woods, in the places untouched by civilization, we're not always the top of the food chain. There are creatures out there that defy our understanding, things that see us as nothing more than prey. I often think about Tommy, about what might have happened to him out there in the dark. I hope, for his sake, that it was quick. But a part of me wonders if he's still out there somewhere, lost in a wilderness that's far more vast and terrifying than we ever imagined. So be careful out there, folks. Respect the wilderness, but never forget that it doesn't always respect us back. And if you ever find yourself lost in the woods at night, hearing strange sounds or seeing shapes that shouldn't be there, don't investigate. Don't be a hero. Just run. Run. And pray that you're faster than whatever's chasing you. Because some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some rescues are better left unattempted. The wilderness holds secrets, and sometimes the price of uncovering those secrets is higher than anyone is willing to pay. Stay safe out there, and remember, in the real wilderness, we're not always the rescuers. Sometimes we're the ones who need rescuing, and the things we need rescuing from are beyond our worst nightmares. Story 21. I've always found solace in the wilderness, but after that night in Glacier National Park, I learned that sometimes the wilderness doesn't want us there. What started as a peaceful solo camping trip turned into a fight for survival, against something I still can't explain. My name is Lisa, and I'm an experienced backcountry camper. I've spent countless nights under the stars, always feeling more at home in the wilderness than in any city. But that trip to Glacier, it changed everything. It was late September, my favorite time to camp. The summer crowds had thinned out, and the crisp autumn air held the promise of winter. I'd planned a 3-day solo trek into one of the park's more remote areas, eager to challenge myself and soak in the solitude. The first day was perfect. I hiked through stunning alpine meadows, the mountains towering around me like ancient guardians. As the sun began to set, I found an ideal spot to make camp, a small clearing near a bubbling stream, sheltered by a stand of old-growth pines. I set up my tent with practiced ease, gathered firewood, and settled in for the night. As darkness fell, I sat by my small campfire, sipping hot tea and listening to the night sounds of the forest. The stars came out, impossibly bright away from city lights, and I felt that familiar sense of peace that only the wilderness can bring. It was well past midnight when I crawled into my tent, exhausted but content. I fell asleep to the gentle murmur of the stream and the distant hooting of an owl. I'm not sure what woke me. Maybe it was a sudden silence, the absence of the nighttime forest sounds. Or maybe it was some primal instinct, warning me of danger, but I found myself wide awake, every nerve on edge. That's when I heard it, something large moving around my campsite. At first, I thought it might be a bear, drawn by the scent of my food. But the footsteps were all wrong, too heavy, too deliberate, my heart pounding. I reached for my flashlight. Should I make noise, try to scare it away, or stay quiet and hope it left on its own? Before I could decide, I heard a new sound that made my blood run cold, my bear canister, which I'd left securely tied to a tree, being opened. Bears can't open bear canisters. Whatever was out there, it wasn't a bear. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, barely daring to breathe, as I listened to the creature rummaging through my supplies. The sounds it made were unlike anything I'd heard before. Not quite animal, not quite human, and underlying it all was a low, rumbling sound that I felt more than heard, like a subsonic growl. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the sound stopped. I strained my ears, trying to determine if the creature had left, but the silence was absolute. No wind in the trees, no stream gurgling, no insects chirping. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Slowly, carefully, I unzipped my sleeping bag and crawled to the tent door. With shaking hands, I unzipped it just enough to peer out. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. Illuminated by the moonlight was a pair of footprints in the soft earth near my tent. But these weren't bear prints, or any animal prints I recognized. They were enormous, easily twice the size of my own foot, and distinctly bipedal. But the shape was all wrong for a human, too wide, with clear claw marks at the end of each toe. I quickly zipped the tent back up, my mind racing. What could have made those prints? Bigfoot? Some unknown species? Or was I losing my mind out here in the wilderness? Sleep was impossible after that. I lay awake, every muscle tensed, listening for any sound of the creature's return. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the tent fabric, I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. But when I emerged from my tent, I realized my ordeal was far from over. My campsite looked like it had been hit by a whirlwind. My bear canister lay empty, its contents strewn across the clearing, deep claw marks scored nearby trees, higher than I could reach. And there, circling my tent, were more of those massive footprints. My hands shaking, I began to pack up camp. Whatever had visited in the night, I had no desire to be there if it came back. But as I was rolling up my sleeping bag, a sound from the forest made me freeze. A twig snapped, then another. Something was moving through the underbrush, coming closer. I abandoned my half-packed gear and ran. I didn't even bother to put on my hiking boots, just fled in my socks, my heart pounding in my ears. Behind me, I could hear something large crashing through the forest in pursuit. I ran blindly, no thought in my head except to get away. Branches whipped my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't slow down. The sound of pursuit was constant, always just behind me, always getting closer. I burst out of the tree line onto a rocky slope and scrambled upward, loose stones sliding under my feet. Risking a glance back, I saw something that defied explanation. There, at the edge of the forest, was a shape that sent chills down my spine. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. But it wasn't the size that terrified me. It was the eyes. Glowing in the early morning light were 2 very intelligent, very angry eyes. For a moment, it just stood there, watching me. Then it let out a roar that shook the very ground and began to climb the slope with terrifying speed. I turned and ran again, my lungs burning, my legs trembling with exhaustion. I had no idea where I was going, no plan except to get away from that thing. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in that frantic flight. But suddenly, mercifully, I heard a sound that didn't belong in the wilderness, a car engine. I changed direction, heading toward the sound. Behind me, I could hear the creature's pursuit slowing, as if it was reluctant to get too close to civilization. I burst out onto a park road, nearly colliding with a surprised park ranger in his truck. I must have been a sight, wild-eyed, clothes torn, feet bloody from running without shoes. "Miss, are you all right?" the ranger asked, jumping out of his vehicle. I couldn't speak, could only shake my head and point back toward the forest. The ranger's eyes widened as he looked past me, and for a moment I was terrified that he saw the creature. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there, just the silent, seemingly peaceful forest. The ranger helped me into his truck and radioed for medical assistance. As we drove back to the ranger station, I tried to explain what had happened. But faced with the daylight and the normal, rational world, my story sounded insane, even to my own ears. In the end, I told them I'd been spooked by a bear in my campsite and had run off in a panic. They seemed to accept this, putting my wild story down to fear and exhaustion. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what chased me through that forest. I've done some research since then, reaching out anonymously to others who claim to have had similar encounters in national parks. Their stories send chills down my spine, not because they're frightening, but because of how familiar they sound. The footprints, the roars, the feeling of being hunted. I still camp, but never alone, and never in Glacier National Park. Sometimes, when I'm in the wilderness and the forest goes quiet, I feel that old fear creeping back. I find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see a dark shape moving just out of sight. I've tried to rationalize what happened that night. Maybe it was a bear, made monstrous by fear and exhaustion. Maybe I was suffering from some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But deep down, I know the truth. What I encountered out there was something beyond explanation, something that shouldn't exist in our rational, ordered world. It's changed the way I see the wilderness. The forests I once found comforting now hold a hint of menace. Every shadow could be hiding something. Every snapping twig could be a footstep. I've come to realize that we're not always welcome in the wild places of the world. There are things out there that defy our understanding, creatures that see us as intruders, or worse, as prey. So the next time you're camping in the backcountry and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, that sense of being watched, remember my story. And maybe, just maybe, think twice about going too far off the beaten path, because some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some wildernesses are better left unexplored. The deep woods hold secrets, ancient and dangerous ones, and sometimes the price of uncovering those secrets is higher than anyone is willing to pay. Stay safe out there, folks. And remember, in the real wilderness, we're not always at the top of the food chain. Sometimes we're the ones being hunted. Story 22. I've always believed that science could explain everything, but after what happened in Pisgah National Forest, I'm not so sure anymore. What started as a routine botany research trip turned into a nightmare that challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world. My name is Dr. Emily Chen, and I lead a team of graduate students studying rare plant species in the Appalachian Mountains. Our latest expedition took us deep into Pisgah National Forest, a sprawling wilderness in western North Carolina. We were on the trail of a potentially new species of orchid, rumored to bloom only once a decade under very specific conditions. Our team consisted of 5 people: myself, 2 of my most promising PhD candidates, Sarah and Mike, and 2 undergrads, Jake and Lily. We were all experienced in fieldwork, well prepared for a week of camping and data collection in the backcountry. The first 3 days were productive and uneventful. We established our base camp in a small clearing near a bubbling stream, perfect for our water needs and not far from where the orchid had been reportedly spotted. Each day, we'd split into teams, combing the forest for any sign of our elusive flower. It was on the 4th day that things began to change. I was with Sarah, pushing through a particularly dense patch of rhododendrons, when we stumbled into a clearing that stopped us in our tracks. The trees surrounding the area were wrong. There's no other way to describe it. Massive oaks and pines lay splintered and broken as if they'd been snapped like twigs. Those still standing bore deep gouges in their trunks, far too high for any known animal in these woods. "Dr. Chen," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "What could have done this?" I shook my head, at a loss for words. My scientific mind raced through possibilities: storm damage, disease, some kind of geological event. But none fit what I was seeing. That's when I noticed the smell. A heavy, musky odor hung in the air, unlike anything I'd encountered before. It was almost animal, but not quite. As we moved further into the clearing, The scent grew stronger. "We should document this," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Take photos, samples of the damaged trees, whatever happened here, it's not natural." As Sarah began photographing the destruction, I knelt to examine one of the fallen trees. The break wasn't clean. It looked like something had literally twisted the trunk until it snapped. And there, in the splintered wood, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Embedded in the tree were tufts of coarse, dark hair. "Sarah!" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. "Come look at this!" She came over, her camera forgotten in her hand. "Is that fur?" Before I could answer, a sound echoed through the forest that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was a roar, unlike anything I'd ever heard before, too deep for a bear, too primal for any animal I knew existed in these mountains. We froze, eyes wide, scanning the tree line. The forest had gone eerily silent, as if every living thing was holding its breath. "We need to get back to camp," I said, grabbing Sarah's arm. "Now." We moved as quickly and quietly as we could through the underbrush, the feeling of being watched pressing down on us like a physical weight. Twice, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, something large, dark, moving parallel to our path. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. We burst into our campsite, startling Mike, who was analyzing samples at the folding table we'd set up. "Whoa, what's wrong?" he asked, taking in our disheveled appearance and wide eyes. "Where are Jake and Lily?" I demanded, looking around the camp. "They're not back yet," Mike said, his brow furrowing with concern. "What's going on?" As Sarah and I explained what we'd seen, Mike's expression changed from confusion to disbelief to fear. "We need to find Jake and Lily and get out of here," I said, already moving to pack up our essential gear. But before we could do anything, we heard it, a scream, high-pitched and terrified. It echoed through the trees before cutting off abruptly. "Lily!" Sarah gasped. We grabbed our emergency packs and headlamps, heading in the direction of the scream. The sun was setting rapidly, long shadows stretching across the forest floor. As darkness fell, every shape seemed to move, every shadow harbored potential danger. We found Jake first. He was running, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth. His face was a mask of terror. "It took her," he gasped as we reached him. "Oh God, it took Lily." "What took her?" I demanded, grabbing his shoulders. "Jake, what did you see?" But he just shook his head, eyes wild. "Not human," he mumbled. "Too big, too fast." A roar split the night, closer this time, much closer. We all spun toward the sound, our headlamp beams cutting through the darkness. That's when we saw it. At the edge of our light, something moved, something massive. I caught glimpses of matted fur, of a shape that walked on two legs but was far too large to be human. And then I saw its eyes, reflecting our light, intelligent, angry, and unmistakably focused on us. "Run," I whispered, and we did. We crashed through the forest, all thoughts of finding Lily temporarily forgotten in our panic. I could hear it behind us, branches snapping like twigs under its weight. The musky odor I'd smelled earlier now seemed to surround us, making the air thick and hard to breathe. We ran until our lungs burned, until our legs felt like lead. But the creature kept pace, always just behind us, herding us deeper into the wilderness. Suddenly, the ground disappeared from under my feet. We'd run right off the edge of a ravine. We tumbled down the steep slope, a tangle of limbs and backpacks, coming to rest in a heap at the bottom. Dazed, I looked up. There, silhouetted against the night sky at the top of the ravine, stood our pursuer. Even from this distance, I could see how massive it was, how utterly alien to anything I'd studied in my years as a biologist. For a long moment, it just stood there watching us. Then, with a final rumbling growl that I felt in my bones, it turned and melted back into the forest. We lay there for a long time, too terrified to move, too exhausted to think. It wasn't until the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees that we finally stirred. "What?" Mike started, his voice hoarse. What was that thing? I shook my head, at a loss for words. Everything I knew, everything I'd studied, told me that what we'd seen was impossible. And yet, we need to find Lily, Sarah said, her voice shaking but determined. We spent the next 2 days searching, jumping at every sound, constantly looking over our shoulders, but we found no sign of Lily, no trace of the creature that had taken her. When we finally made it back to civilization and reported what had happened, we were met with disbelief and suspicion. The official report cited a bear attack, with Lily listed as missing, presumed dead. Our stories of a massive, unknown creature were dismissed as the product of fear and exhaustion, but I know what I saw, what we all saw. In the years since, I've reached out to others who claim to have had similar encounters in national forests across the country. Their stories send chills down my spine, not because they're frightening, but because of how familiar they sound. The destruction, the roars, the feeling of being hunted by something that shouldn't exist. I still work as a botanist, still conduct field research, but never in Pisgah, and never without wondering what else might be out there, hidden in the deep woods, just beyond the reach of our scientific understanding. So the next time you're hiking in a national forest and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, that sense of being watched, remember our story. And maybe, just maybe, consider that there are some mysteries in nature that science hasn't yet explained. Because in the vast wilderness of our world, there are things that defy classification, creatures that turn researchers into prey. And sometimes, the most important discoveries are the ones we're not prepared to make. Stay safe out there, folks. And remember, in the real wilderness, we're not always the observers. Sometimes, we're the ones being observed. And what's watching us might be beyond our wildest imaginations.